Throughout history, kings have shaped nations, changed the fate of millions, and left behind legacies that still echo today. But not all rulers are remembered for greatness. Some are known for corruption, cruelty, and disastrous decisions that brought suffering to their people and downfall to their empires. In this video, we explore 20 of the worst kings in history, from Nero and Caligula in ancient Rome to Leopold II of Belgium, Ivan the Terrible, Charles II of Spain, and many more. Each story reveals how arrogance, greed, and reckless rule can destroy kingdoms and leave behind dark lessons for the future. If you're fascinated by history's most notorious rulers and the consequences of their actions, this video is for you. Here's a list of 20 of the worst kings in history, along with reasons why they earned such reputations. These rulers are often remembered for cruelty, corruption, incompetence, or destructive decisions that brought disaster to their people and downfall to their empires. 1. King John of England, 1166 to 1216. King John of England, often remembered as one of the most unpopular monarchs in English history, reigned from 1199 to 1216. His legacy is dominated by military failures, harsh taxation, and conflicts with both his nobles and the church, all of which contributed to the eventual signing of the Magna Carta in 1215. Although his reign had some administrative efficiency, the weight of his poor leadership choices far outweighs his few strengths. John was the youngest son of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, and his nickname Lackland hinted at the fact that he was never expected to inherit much. His early character traits of deceit, cruelty, and selfish ambition soon revealed themselves once he ascended the throne. His most glaring failure came in foreign policy. England at the time controlled significant lands in France, including Normandy, Anjou, and Aquitaine. Through a series of poor decisions, John managed to lose most of these territories to King Philip II of France. His inability to maintain English power on the continent was a humiliation not only for the crown, but also for the noble families who had invested wealth and prestige in these lands. At home, John developed a reputation for greed and cruelty. He imposed heavy taxes to fund his military campaigns, which had failed miserably. His arbitrary use of justice, seizing lands, punishing opponents, and even extorting money from widows who wanted to remarry, generated enormous resentment among the nobility. Unlike some of his predecessors, who built loyalty among their barons, John alienated nearly all of them. His cruelty extended to personal relationships. He was accused of abducting the wives and daughters of his barons and exploiting them, a scandal that worsened his reputation. One of the defining conflicts of his reign was with Pope Innocent III. John resisted the Pope's choice of Stephen Langton as Archbishop of Canterbury, leading to his excommunication and England being placed under interdict, meaning church services were suspended throughout the land. This not only hurt John's image as a Christian king, but also destabilized English society. Eventually, John was forced to submit to the Pope, even agreeing to make England a papal fief. This humiliated many nobles who saw their king bowing to a foreign power. The breaking point came with the Barons' Rebellion. Fed up with John's arbitrary rule, they forced him to agree to the Magna Carta in 1215. While John never intended to honor its provisions, this moment became one of the most important in constitutional history, laying the foundation for the rule of law and the limitation of monarchical power. John's refusal to uphold the charter reignited conflict, plunging the country into civil war known as the First Barons' War. His death in 1616, possibly from dysentery, ended his disastrous reign, but his reputation remained as one of England's worst kings. Chroniclers of his time and later historians painted him as faithless, treacherous, and incompetent, a ruler who nearly destroyed his kingdom. 2. Nero of Rome, 37 to 68 AD. Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, known simply as Nero, reigned as Roman emperor from 54 to 68 AD. His reign has become synonymous with tyranny, extravagance, and cruelty, making him one of the most infamous rulers in Roman history. While some modern historians argue that his image may have been exaggerated by hostile sources, there is no denying that his leadership brought instability and horror to the Roman Empire. Nero ascended the throne at the age of 16 after the death of his adopted father, Emperor Claudius. At first, under the guidance of his mother Agrippina, tutor Seneca, and advisor Burrus, Nero's rule was moderate. However, his lust for power and suspicion of rivals soon emerged. He arranged the murder of his own mother, Agrippina, after she became too influential and threatening. He later ordered the execution of his first wife, Octavia, under false charges of adultery. These acts of brutality shocked Rome and set the tone for his later tyranny. One of the most infamous events of his reign was the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. Ancient accounts claim that Nero either negligently ignored the blaze or, according to legend, played his lyre while the city burned. Whether he started the fire or not remains debated, but Nero's response sealed his reputation. He confiscated large portions of the burned city to construct his extravagant golden house, Domus Aurea, complete with a colossal statue of himself. To deflect blame, Nero accused Christians of starting the fire and launched one of the earliest major persecutions against them. Christians were tortured, crucified, and burned alive, marking a dark chapter in Roman history. Nero's obsession with personal fame further discredited his rule. He fancied himself a great artist, actor, and charioteer, forcing Roman elites to attend his performances under threat. Such behavior scandalized Roman society, which expected emperors to uphold dignity and military competence. Meanwhile, Nero neglected military and administrative responsibilities, leaving the empire vulnerable. His mismanagement led to revolts, including the rebellion in Britain led by Queen Boudica, and discontent in Gaul and Judea. Financially, Nero drained the empire through lavish spending on palaces, games, and spectacles. To fund his extravagance, he increased taxation and confiscated property from the wealthy, further alienating the aristocracy. His reckless fiscal policies contributed to widespread resentment. By 68 AD, multiple governors and generals revolted against his rule. Deserted by his guards and condemned as a public enemy by the Senate, Nero fled Rome. Facing capture, he committed suicide, reportedly declaring, "What an artist dies in me." His death ended the Julio-Claudian dynasty and plunged Rome into the chaos of the Year of the Four Emperors. Nero remains a symbol of tyranny, remembered less for governance and more for cruelty, extravagance, and the destruction he left behind. 3. Caligula of Rome, 12 to 41 AD. Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, better known as Caligula, ruled Rome from 37 to 41 AD. His reign was brief, but has gone down in history as one of the most notorious examples of cruelty, insanity, and abuse of power in leadership. Initially welcomed as the son of the beloved General Germanicus, Caligula's reign soon descended into madness that shocked Rome. At the beginning, Caligula's accession was greeted with joy. His father, Germanicus, had been adored by the army and people, and Caligula's early acts, such as granting bonuses to soldiers and releasing prisoners, won him popularity. However, after a severe illness only months into his reign, his behavior changed dramatically. Ancient writers portray him as a sadistic and capricious ruler who delighted in humiliating others. He's infamous for his extravagant projects and bizarre behavior. He drained the treasury with wasteful spending, including the construction of massive palaces and spectacles. One of his most notorious acts was allegedly planning to make his horse, Incitatus, a consul, a story symbolizing his mockery of Roman political traditions. Whether entirely true or exaggerated, it reflects how contemporaries perceived his disdain for institutions. His cruelty was legendary. Caligula executed nobles for trivial reasons, often seizing their property to fund his lavish lifestyle. He reportedly enjoyed watching people tortured and killed, treating executions as entertainment. He humiliated senators, forcing them to run alongside his chariot, and boasted of his absolute power over life and death. Sexual immorality and incestuous relationships further stained his reputation, with rumors of affairs with his sisters and the abuse of noblewomen. Caligula also strained Rome's finances through reckless spending. He staged grandiose building projects, including attempting to build a bridge of ships across the Bay of Baie, simply to flaunt his wealth. His military ventures were equally absurd. In one campaign, he led his army to the shores of the English Channel and ordered them to collect seashells as spoils of war. Such actions demonstrated a lack of seriousness and squandered resources. His relationship with the Senate deteriorated rapidly as he insulted and undermined their authority. He demanded to be worshipped as a living god, erecting statues of himself in temples and even in Jerusalem, an act that provoked outrage among Jews. This megalomania alienated not only the Senate but also religious communities within the empire. By 41 AD, discontent reached a breaking point. Members of the Praetorian Guard, senators, and even palace officials conspired against him. He was assassinated in a palace plot, stabbed to death along with his wife and daughter. Though his reign lasted only 4 years, Caligula's notoriety endured for centuries. Whether some of the most extreme stories were exaggerated or not, the combination of cruelty, extravagance, and bizarre behavior makes him one of history's most infamous rulers.
4. King Leopold II of Belgium, 1835 to 1909. King Leopold II of Belgium reigned from 1865 to 1909, but his name is most notoriously tied to his personal colony, the Congo Free State. Unlike traditional monarchs who ruled their own nations poorly, Leopold's cruelty extended far beyond Europe. His exploitation of the Congo and its people led to one of the most horrific atrocities of the 19th century, with millions of Africans suffering and dying under his regime. Leopold presented himself as a humanitarian and philanthropist, claiming he wished to bring civilization and Christianity to Africa. In reality, his motives were entirely self-serving. Through diplomatic manipulation, he convinced European powers at the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 to grant him personal control over the Congo Free State, rather than placing it under Belgium or any other nation. This made him unique in history, the sole owner of a colony, ruling it as his private property. Once in control, Leopold established a system of brutal exploitation centered around rubber and ivory. Local populations were forced into labor under the threat of violence. The notorious Force Publique, his private army, enforced quotas with unimaginable cruelty. Failure to meet rubber collection quotas often resulted in mutilation, particularly the cutting off of hands. Villages were burned, women were taken hostage, and entire communities were destroyed. Estimates of the death toll range from 5 to 10 million Congolese people over a few decades. Leopold never visited the Congo himself. Instead, he orchestrated this system from Europe, all while cultivating a false image of benevolence. He built lavish public works in Belgium with the wealth extracted from Congo, portraying himself as a great modernizer of his nation. Meanwhile, he silenced criticism through propaganda and bribery, though reports from missionaries and whistleblowers eventually exposed the horrors of his regime. International outrage grew as photographs and testimonies of mutilated Congolese spread. Figures like British diplomat Roger Casement and activist E.D. Morel spearheaded a campaign against Leopold's abuses. By 1908, pressure from the international community forced Leopold to relinquish personal control, and the Congo Free State was annexed by Belgium as a colony. By then, the damage was irreversible, and Leopold had amassed enormous personal wealth. Leopold's legacy remains deeply stained. While he is sometimes credited with modernizing Belgium, his actions in the Congo make him one of the most brutal figures of colonial history. His exploitation of millions of people for personal profit, coupled with the extraordinary cruelty inflicted on the Congolese, secures his place among the worst rulers in history. The legacy of fear and autocracy he left behind influenced Russian rulers for generations. 5. Ivan IV, Ivan the Terrible of Russia, 1530 to 1584. Ivan IV Vasilievich, better known as Ivan the Terrible, was the first ruler to be formally crowned as Tsar of all Russia. His reign from 1747 to 1584 was marked by both achievements and terror, with his violent and paranoid behavior casting a long shadow over Russian history. While he centralized power and expanded Russian territory, his cruelty and repression devastated his people and destabilized the state. Ivan's early years shaped his ruthless character. Orphaned at a young age, he grew up in a hostile court environment filled with intrigue and violence. When he took power, he initially showed promise, introducing reforms such as codifying laws, establishing a standing army, and promoting trade. For a time, his reign seemed poised to strengthen Russia. However, his increasingly erratic and violent behavior soon overshadowed these reforms. Ivan's most infamous policy was the establishment of the Operechnina in 1565. This system divided Russia into two parts, one under Ivan's personal control and the other under traditional administration. Ivan's personal guard, the Operechniki, terrorized the population, carrying out mass executions, confiscations, and acts of terror against perceived enemies. The most horrific episode was the massacre of Novgorod in 1570, where thousands of citizens were tortured and killed under accusations of treason. Ivan's paranoia extended to his own family. In a fit of rage, he struck and killed his eldest son, Ivan Ivanovich, in 1581. This act not only devastated him personally, but also left Russia without a competent heir, leading to the succession crisis known as the Time of Troubles after his death. His second son, Fyodor, was weak and ineffective, leaving Russia vulnerable. Militarily, Ivan's ambitions led to costly failures. His attempts to expand into the Baltic through the Livonian War ended disastrously, draining resources and weakening the state. While he expanded Russian territory eastward into Siberia, these gains were overshadowed by the destruction his wars brought to the Russian heartland. Ivan's reign left Russia both larger and more centralized, but also scarred by terror, economic decline, and social unrest. His combination of initial reforms and later brutality makes him a complex figure, but his descent into paranoia and cruelty ensures his place as one of the worst rulers in history. The legacy of fear and autocracy he left behind influenced Russian rulers for generations.
6. Charles VI of France, 1368 to 1422. Charles VI of France, known as Charles the Mad, reigned from 1380 to 1422 during one of the most turbulent periods in French history. His reign is remembered not for personal cruelty, but for tragic mental illness that left the kingdom weak and vulnerable during the 100 Years' War with England. His long rule saw internal conflict, civil war, and national humiliation, making him one of the most disastrous monarchs of medieval Europe. Charles ascended the throne at the age of 11, with France already embroiled in war with England. Early in his reign, regents managed his affairs, but when he began ruling independently, Charles initially showed promise. He took steps to stabilize finances, suppress corruption, and assert royal authority. For a time, he was even nicknamed Charles the Beloved. Yet, in 1392, during a military campaign, Charles suffered a mental breakdown that marked a turning point for both him and France. Charles's illness manifested in violent episodes of paranoia and psychosis. In one notorious incident, he attacked his own knights, killing several of them. At other times, he failed to recognize his wife and children, believed he was made of glass, or refused to bathe or change clothes for months. His periods of lucidity alternated with long stretches of incapacity, leaving France without stable leadership for decades. The king's incapacity plunged France into political chaos. Rival factions among the nobility, particularly the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, fought for control of the regency and the royal court. This infighting weakened France internally, while the English renewed their campaigns in the 100 Years' War with England. The disastrous French defeat at Agincourt in 1415, where English longbowmen decimated French knights, epitomized the kingdom's vulnerability during Charles's reign. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420 marked the lowest point of his rule. Under this humiliating treaty, Charles VI recognized Henry V of England as his heir, disinheriting his own son, the Dauphin Charles, later Charles VII. This agreement effectively promised to unite the crowns of France and England under an English king, an outcome many French nobles bitterly resented. While Charles may not have personally negotiated the treaty, his condition prevented him. His weakness made it possible. By the time Charles VI died in 1422, France was fractured, much of northern territory was under English control, and the monarchy's legitimacy was in question. His long, tragic reign symbolized the dangers of weak leadership in a time of crisis. Though not cruel by nature, Charles VI is remembered as one of France's worst kings because his incapacity opened the door to foreign domination and civil war. His illness was personal tragedy, but its consequences for France were catastrophic. 7. Richard III of England, 1452 to 1485. Richard III, the last Plantagenet king, ruled from 1483 until his death at 1485 at the Battle of Bosworth Field. His reign lasted just over 2 years, but it has become one of the most infamous in English history. Whether through his own actions or the propaganda of his Tudor successors, Richard III is remembered as a usurper, a murderer, and a tyrant. Richard was the younger brother of King Edward IV. When Edward died suddenly in 1483, his 12-year-old son, Edward V, was set to inherit the throne. Richard, appointed as Lord Protector, quickly moved to consolidate power. Within weeks, Edward V and his younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, were placed in the Tower of London. Parliament declared Edward's marriage invalid, rendering his children illegitimate, and Richard was crowned king. The princes disappeared from public view and were never seen again. While their exact fate remains a mystery, most historians believe Richard ordered their murder, cementing his reputation as a ruthless usurper. Richard's reign was marked by efforts to consolidate his legitimacy. He attempted reforms, such as improving legal access for the poor, but these were overshadowed by the suspicions surrounding the prince's disappearance. His enemies, including powerful nobles, rallied behind Henry Tudor, a distant Lancastrian claimant. Meanwhile, Richard's harsh treatment of opponents alienated potential allies. The decisive moment came at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485. Richard fought bravely,
but was betrayed by key supporters who switched sides during the battle. He was killed on the field, making him the last English king to die in combat. His death ended the Wars of the Roses and ushered in the Tudor dynasty under Henry VII. Richard's body was hastily buried and rediscovered only in 2012, reigniting debates about his true character. Much of Richard's negative reputation comes from Tudor propaganda, particularly Shakespeare's portrayal of him as a deformed, scheming villain. Yet, even without exaggeration, his usurpation, likely involvement in the prince's deaths, and short, unstable reign justify his place among England's worst kings. His failure to secure loyalty or stability ensured his downfall and tarnished his legacy permanently.
8. Louis XVI of France, 1754 to 1793. Louis XVI, the last king of France before the French Revolution, reigned from 1774 to 1792. Though not cruel or sadistic like other bad monarchs, he is remembered as one of the worst because of indecision, weakness, and failure to adapt to the political and social crises of his time. His inability to reform France's finances or address popular grievances led directly to revolution, the collapse of the monarchy, and his execution. Louis inherited a deeply indebted kingdom, burdened by costly wars and extravagant spending under his predecessors. Though personally frugal, he failed to impose fiscal reform, blocked by aristocratic resistance and his own lack of firmness. His government's attempts to tax the nobility and reform finances repeatedly failed, leaving the country bankrupt. Meanwhile, he worsened matters by supporting the American Revolution, which, while ideologically popular in France, cost enormous sums and further destabilized the treasury. Politically, Louis lacked decisiveness. He vacillated between reform and reaction, never committing fully to either. In 1789, he summoned the Estates General for the first time in 175 years, a move that opened the door to revolutionary demands. When the Third Estate declared itself the National Assembly, Louis hesitated, at times attempting compromise, at other times preparing to use force. This indecision eroded trust on all sides. As the revolution gathered momentum, Louis's actions alienated the people. His attempted flight from Paris in 1791, known as the Flight to Varennes, was a disastrous mistake. The king and his family were caught while trying to escape and were returned to Paris under guard. This destroyed his credibility as a constitutional monarch and convinced many that he was a traitor plotting with foreign powers. By 1792, France was at war with Austria and Prussia, and radicals in Paris increasingly viewed the monarchy as a threat. In August, the monarchy was abolished and Louis was arrested. Tried for treason, he was convicted by the National Convention. In January 1793, Louis XVI was executed by guillotine, an act that shocked Europe and symbolized the revolution's break with monarchy. Louis XVI's failures were less about malice and more about weakness. He lacked the leadership qualities necessary in a time of crisis. His inability to implement reforms, control events, or win the trust of his people doomed the monarchy. Though personally mild-mannered and intelligent, he became the symbol of royal incompetence, remembered as a king whose indecision cost him his throne and his life. 9. George IV of Britain, 1762 to 1830. George IV, who reigned as king of the United Kingdom from 1820 to 1830, is remembered as one of Britain's most self-indulgent and unpopular monarchs. His reign, following a long tenure as Prince Regent during the father George III's mental illness, was marked by extravagance, scandal, and detachment from national concerns. Though not a triumph in the traditional sense, his failure as a moral and political leader places him among the worst monarchs of his country. From his youth, George was known for extravagance. He accumulated massive debts due to gambling, fine living, and a passion for luxury.
His relationship with his father was strained, and his numerous affairs scandalized society. His secret marriage to Maria Fitzherbert, a Catholic, was invalid under British law, but it damaged his reputation. His official marriage to Caroline of Brunswick was a disaster, with both spouses despising each other and airing their grievances publicly. As Prince Regent, 1811 to 1820, George wielded power during the final years of the Napoleonic Wars and their aftermath. Yet he showed little interest in governance, leaving ministers to manage affairs while he pursued personal pleasures. His reputation for gluttony and indulgence earned him ridicule, with caricatures mocking his obesity and excesses. When he became king in 1820, George IV's conduct further alienated the public. He attempted to divorce Queen Caroline, sparking a national scandal. The Queen Caroline affair turned public opinion against him, as many sympathized with Caroline over her unpopular husband. His lavish spending on building projects, such as the Royal Pavilion in Brighton, contrasted sharply with widespread poverty and unrest in post-war Britain. Politically, George IV resisted reforms, particularly Catholic emancipation, which sought to grant civil rights to Catholics in the United Kingdom. His reluctance put him at odds with influential leaders and delayed progress. Though emancipation was eventually passed in 1829, George's opposition demonstrated his reactionary stance. By the time of his death in 1830, George IV was despised by much of the population. His self-indulgence, scandals, and neglect of duty overshadowed any contributions to art and architecture he patronized. Unlike his father, George III, who was respected despite mental illness, George IV left no positive legacy. He is remembered as a symbol of decadence and poor leadership at a time when Britain required moral authority and political stability. 10. Christian VII of Denmark, 1749 to 1808. Christian VII of Denmark, who reigned from 1766 to 1808, is often cited as one of Denmark's worst monarchs due to his mental illness, erratic behavior, and inability to govern effectively. His incapacity led to corruption, manipulation by courtiers, and political instability, even as reforms were carried out in his name by others. Christian ascended the throne at the age of 17. Almost immediately, his behavior shocked the court. He was prone to paranoia, self-mutilation, and bizarre acts, such as striking his courtiers without reason. His erratic conduct was later recognized as signs of schizophrenia, or another severe mental disorder. While his illness excused personal responsibility, it rendered him incapable of ruling effectively. In his early reign, Denmark suffered from mismanagement as Christian showed little interest in governance. He was more focused on personal indulgences, including drinking, prostitutes, and cruel amusements. This allowed corrupt ministers and favorites to exploit him, enriching themselves at the kingdom's expense. Ironically, some of the most significant reforms of his reign came not from Christian himself, but from Johann Friedrich Struensee, a German physician and minister who gained enormous influence. Struensee introduced enlightened reforms inspired by the ideas of the Enlightenment: freedom of the press, abolition of torture, and modernization of the administration. However, his relationship with Queen Caroline Matilda, Christian's wife, scandalized the court. In 1772, a palace coup led to Struensee's arrest and execution, ending Denmark's brief experiment with reform. For the remainder of Christian's reign, power was exercised by regents and advisors, particularly his son Frederick, who later became King Frederick VI. Christian remained king in name, but was largely sidelined. His long reign thus became a period of stagnation, with the monarchy weakened by internal corruption and external interference. Christian VII's legacy is tragic. While his personal illness made him unfit to rule, the consequences for Denmark were significant. His incapacity allowed others to manipulate power, reforms to be reversed, and the kingdom to drift through critical decades. He is remembered as a king who was more a pawn than a ruler, symbolizing the dangers of monarchs who are unable to govern. His reign highlights the vulnerability of absolute monarchy when the king himself is incapacitated.
11. King Farouk of Egypt, 1920 to 1965.
reigned 1936 to 1952. King Farouk of Egypt remains one of the most infamous monarchs of the 20th century, a man whose personal excesses and political incompetence directly contributed to the collapse of Egypt's monarchy. Ascending the throne at the tender age of 16 in 1936, Farouk inherited not only the crown, but also a nation struggling to balance modernization with the heavy influence of Britain, which maintained military and political dominance over Egypt, despite formal independence. Egyptians initially hoped Farouk's youth and charisma would help lead the nation toward sovereignty and reform, but those hopes were soon dashed. Farouk quickly developed a reputation for extravagance. At a time when ordinary Egyptians faced widespread poverty and inequality, the king amassed vast personal fortunes, indulging in gambling, women, luxury cars, palaces, and jewels. His gluttonous lifestyle was legendary. He was reportedly obese by his 20s, consuming lavish meals while the poor went hungry. Such behavior bred resentment among Egyptians who saw their king as indifferent to their struggles. He collected rare stamps, coins, and even bought up slot machines when they were banned in Egypt, a sign of his obsession with material possessions rather than governance. Politically, Farouk's reign was marked by corruption and weakness. He alienated Egypt's political class by interfering in parliamentary affairs, often dissolving governments and manipulating elections to suit his whims. Meanwhile, the palace became a center of graft and bribery. British officials, who still maintained a strong presence, grew increasingly disillusioned with him. During World War II, Farouk's refusal to take a firm stand against Axis influence in Egypt created tensions with the Allies. His government was seen as unreliable and self-serving, while ordinary Egyptians viewed him as a puppet incapable of standing up for national interests. Perhaps the most catastrophic moment of his reign came during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. Farouk's army, poorly trained, ill-equipped, and undermined by corruption in military procurement, suffered humiliating defeats against the newly established State of Israel. Egyptians were outraged, not only at the loss, but at the incompetence of their leadership. The war exposed the rot in the monarchy and accelerated calls for change. Many blamed Farouk personally for the disgrace, as stories spread of military officials embezzling funds meant for weapons and supplies. By the early 1950s, discontent had reached a boiling point. Workers and students protested in Cairo, and even the army grew restless. In 1952, the Free Officers Movement, led by Gamal Abdel Nasser and Mohammad Naguib, staged a coup. Farouk was forced to abdicate in favor of his infant son and sent into exile. The monarchy itself was abolished shortly after, replaced by a republic. Egyptians celebrated his downfall as the end of a corrupt and decadent era. Farouk lived out his days in exile in Italy, still clinging to his lavish lifestyle, but gradually fading into obscurity. He grew enormously overweight and died of a heart attack at the age of 45. His downfall was a textbook example of how detachment from the realities of one's people, combined with corruption and personal vice, can destroy not only a king, but an entire monarchy. Farouk is remembered less as a statesman and more as a symbol of squandered opportunity, his reign marking the final chapter of Egypt's royal dynasty. 12. Zhengde Emperor of China, 1491 to 1521, reigned 1505 to 1521. The Zhengde Emperor, born Zhu Hojiao, was the 10th emperor of the Ming dynasty and one of its most notorious failures. Ascending to the throne in 1505 at just 14 years old, Zhengde inherited an empire that was wealthy and relatively stable. Yet his reign soon descended into chaos as he abandoned his duties in favor of indulgence, play acting, and reckless pursuits that drained the treasury and destabilized governance. From the beginning, Zhengde showed little interest in state affairs. Unlike earlier Ming emperors, who, despite their flaws, at least recognized the burdens of rulership, Zhengde treated the throne as an opportunity for personal amusement. He constructed lavish palaces and pleasure gardens, filled with exotic animals, entertainers, and women.
Rather than governing from the forbidden city, he often disappeared for weeks, dressing up as commoners or soldiers and embarking on whimsical adventures. These escapades became infamous, as he would assume false identities and engage in bizarre theatrics while the empire languished under corrupt eunuchs and neglected ministers. Zhengde's foreign policy was equally reckless. He displayed fascination with foreign cultures and peoples, particularly Muslims and Central Asians, often indulging in exotic customs rather than maintaining Chinese traditions. His erratic interests led to wasteful military campaigns. In one infamous incident, he personally led a military expedition against Mongol raiders, but his motives appeared more related to adventure than actual strategy. His presence disrupted military discipline, and while the campaign succeeded partially, it drained resources and exposed his lack of seriousness as a commander. The emperor's obsession with pleasure also extended to dangerous hobbies. He indulged in drinking and reckless horse riding, often endangering himself. In 1521, he died at just 30 after falling into a lake during a drunken boating trip and contracting a fatal illness. His premature death left the Ming dynasty weakened as the court scrambled to maintain stability. Historians view Zhengde as a tragic figure who embodied the dangers of unchecked imperial power without responsibility. The Ming dynasty was resilient enough to survive his misrule, but his reign exemplified the growing decadence that would later contribute to the dynasty's eventual collapse in the 17th century. Rather than a wise sovereign, he is remembered as a wayward child on the throne, more interested in theatrics than the welfare of his empire. His reign is often cited as one of the clearest examples of how personal indulgence by a monarch can undermine centuries of institutional stability. 13. Paul I of Russia, 1754 to 1801, reigned 1796 to 1801. Paul I of Russia, son of Catherine the Great, was one of the most erratic rulers in Russian history, whose brief reign left a legacy of instability, paranoia, and alienation. Unlike his mother, who was pragmatic, cultured, and politically astute, Paul developed a reputation for impulsiveness and cruelty. His reign lasted only 5 years, but it was so destructive and unstable that it ended in his assassination by conspirators within his own court. Paul's upbringing shaped much of his troubled reign. He was excluded from political power during Catherine's long rule, growing resentful and paranoid. By the time he ascended to the throne in 1796, he was determined to undo many of his mother's policies. Unfortunately, this impulse often manifested in rash and poorly considered decisions. Paul was obsessed with military discipline and attempted to impose Prussian-style regulations on the Russian army. Soldiers were forced to endure brutal drills and wear uncomfortable uniforms unsuited to Russia's climate. Harsh punishments for minor infractions created widespread resentment among the troops. In domestic policy, Paul alienated both nobles and peasants. He reversed Catherine's relatively liberal policies by curtailing the freedoms of the nobility, including restricting their ability to travel abroad. He also interfered heavily in court life, enforcing rigid etiquette and punishing those who failed to comply. While he attempted some reforms to benefit serfs, these were inconsistent and often overshadowed by his authoritarian tendencies. His arbitrary decrees, combined with his volatile temper, made him deeply unpopular with nearly every social class. Foreign policy under Paul was equally chaotic. Initially, he aligned with Britain and Austria against revolutionary France, but his erratic personality led to sudden reversals. In 1800, he abruptly switched sides, allying with Napoleon and turning against Britain. He even proposed a joint invasion of India with France, a wildly unrealistic scheme that alarmed Russian elites. His constant policy shifts undermined Russia's credibility abroad and further destabilized the empire's strategic position. Paul's paranoia also contributed to his downfall. He feared assassination and surrounded himself with guards, yet treated those around him with suspicion and cruelty. His unpredictable rages and punishments alienated the nobility, who increasingly saw him as unfit to rule. Finally, in 1801, a group of nobles and army officers conspired to remove him. Paul was assassinated in his bedroom, reportedly strangled after a struggle, while his son Alexander was placed on the throne. Historians debate whether Paul's reign could have been salvaged had he lived longer, but consensus hold that his impulsivity and paranoia made him a liability. He inherited an empire at its peak and destabilized it within just a few years. His legacy is overshadowed by his mother's achievements and his son's later triumphs against Napoleon, leaving Paul remembered as one of Russia's worst monarchs, an unstable ruler undone by his own flaws.
14. King Ranasinghe Ranasidu of Sri Lanka reigned 1521 to 1526. King Ranasidu, also known as Bhuvanekabahu VII, ruled the kingdom of Kotte in Sri Lanka during the early 16th century. His reign was short and disastrous, remembered primarily for weakness, corruption, and betrayal of his people at a time when foreign powers were beginning to dominate the island. Though less globally known than some European monarchs, his failures played a key role in Sri Lanka's decline and colonization. Ranasidu came to power after the Vijayabahu Revolt of 1521, when he and his brothers overthrew and killed their father, Vijayabahu VII. This violent act, known as the Vijayabaya Kolaya, fractured the kingdom into rival factions ruled by the brothers. Ranasidu took control of the Kotte kingdom, but quickly proved unable to unify or strengthen it. Instead, his rule deepened divisions and left the island vulnerable to external threats. His most significant failure was his dealings with the Portuguese, who had arrived in Sri Lanka at the beginning of the 16th century. The Portuguese sought to establish dominance over the island's trade, particularly its lucrative cinnamon exports. Ranasidu, instead of resisting, allied with them to secure his own power. In doing so, he betrayed traditional rulers and allowed foreign influence to take root. The Portuguese exploited his weakness, gaining footholds that would eventually enable them to dominate much of Sri Lanka. Domestically, his governance was marked by instability. He lacked the charisma or strength to command loyalty from nobles, many of whom turned against him. His reliance on the Portuguese deepened resentment among local leaders who saw him as a collaborator rather than a protector of the kingdom. The divisions he fostered created a cycle of conflict, weakening Sri Lanka's ability to resist colonization. Peasant uprisings and noble rivalries became common, undermining stability further. Ranasidu's reign ended violently in 1526 when he was assassinated, likely by his own ministers or rivals who had grown tired of his failures. His death did not restore unity, but plunged the kingdom deeper into chaos. Over the following decades, Sri Lanka became increasingly dominated by the Portuguese, marking the start of centuries of colonial interference. In this sense, Ranasidu's failures had lasting consequences far beyond his brief rule. He is remembered as one of Sri Lanka's worst monarchs because he combined weakness of character with betrayal of national interests. At a time when unity and strength were desperately needed to resist foreign encroachment, he chose self-interest and collaboration, opening the door to conquest. His reign symbolizes how weak leadership can hasten the downfall of a kingdom. 15. King Charles II of Spain, 1661 to 1700, reigned 1665 to 1700. King Charles II of Spain is remembered as one of Europe's most tragic and ineffective monarchs, a ruler whose personal frailty and inability to govern reflected the decline of the once mighty Spanish Empire. Known as the Hechizado, the Bewitched, Charles was the last of the Spanish Habsburgs, a dynasty plagued by generations of inbreeding that culminated in his severe physical and mental disabilities. Charles became king at the age of 4, following the death of his father, Philip IV. Because of his young age and fragile health, the early years of his reign were dominated by regents, including his mother, Mariana of Austria. Unfortunately, the regency was marked by corruption, factionalism, and poor governance. Spain's economy, already weakened by costly wars and declining colonial revenues, continued to deteriorate. By the time Charles took personal control, the empire was deeply in debt, its military overextended, and its prestige waning. Physically, Charles was frail, with numerous health issues caused by generations of Habsburg inbreeding. He reportedly could not chew food properly, had difficulty speaking, and suffered frequent illnesses. Mentally, he was often described as slow and indecisive, unable to grasp the complexities of governance. These disabilities left him dependent on advisors and courtiers who often manipulated him for their own benefit. Under Charles's reign, Spain continued its decline as a great power. The once feared Spanish army suffered defeats, and the empire lost territory in Europe to France under Louis XIV. Domestically, inflation, famine, and economic stagnation created widespread misery. Charles proved unable to implement reforms or resist the influence of powerful noble factions, leading to endless court intrigue. Corruption and inefficiency flourished, while ordinary Spaniards bore the burden of heavy taxes and hardship. One of the most significant failures of Charles's reign was his inability to produce an heir. Despite 2 marriages, he remained childless, a consequence of his poor health and likely infertility. This failure created a succession crisis that destabilized European politics. Upon his death in 1700, the question of who would inherit the Spanish throne sparked the War of the Spanish Succession, a massive conflict that drew in most of Europe and reshaped the continent's balance of power. Charles II is remembered as one of the worst monarchs not because of cruelty or tyranny, but because of his sheer ineffectiveness. His reign embodied the consequences of dynastic short-sightedness, as centuries of inbreeding had produced a monarch physically incapable of ruling effectively. He presided over the collapse of Spain's status as a leading European power and left behind chaos that plunged the continent into war. In many ways, his tragic life was less his own fault than that of the dynasty that created him. But history nevertheless remembers him as a king whose personal weaknesses symbolized the fall of an empire.
16. King George IV of England, 1762 to 1830. George IV, Prince Regent from 1811 and King from 1820 to 1830, is often remembered less for his governance and more for his extravagance, indulgence, and detachment from the realities of his kingdom. Though Britain during his reign was a global superpower, much of its strength came from the groundwork laid by his predecessors, not from his own leadership. His personal flaws, irresponsible spending, and lack of political engagement cement his place among history's most disappointing monarchs. George was notorious for his hedonistic lifestyle. Even as Prince Regent, he spent extravagantly on architecture, fashion, and art, commissioning opulent buildings such as the Royal Pavilion in Brighton and lavish renovations of Windsor Castle. While these projects added to Britain's cultural legacy, they drained the royal treasury and required taxpayers to cover enormous debts. At a time when ordinary citizens struggled with the consequences of the Napoleonic Wars, George's wasteful spending seemed particularly offensive. His debts ran into the millions, a staggering figure for the early 19th century. Politically, George IV played little constructive role. His regency had begun due to his father, George III's mental illness, and many hoped he might be a fresh, capable leader. Instead, he showed little interest in reform or governance. He opposed Catholic emancipation and resisted changes that would have modernized Britain politically. His prejudices and unwillingness to adapt alienated many subjects. Unlike his father, who was seen as dutiful, if eccentric, George IV was viewed as selfish and incompetent. His personal life further damaged his reputation. His marriage to Caroline of Brunswick was disastrous. He treated her cruelly and publicly sought divorce, resulting in one of the great scandals of the age. Their bitter dispute captivated the public and embarrassed the monarchy. At his coronation in 1821, Caroline attempted to enter Westminster Abbey and was physically barred, a humiliation that turned many against George. As king, he relied heavily on ministers to handle affairs, and though he occasionally offered input, he lacked the vision and consistency to influence policy meaningfully. His health deteriorated due to obesity and alcoholism, and he became increasingly reclusive. By his death in 1830, Britain had little to thank him for, beyond cultural contributions born from vanity. He embodied the worst traits of monarchy: detachment, extravagance, and disdain for responsibility. 17. Sultan Ibrahim of the Ottoman Empire, 1615 to 1648. Known as Ibrahim the Mad, Sultan Ibrahim of the Ottoman Empire ruled from 1440 until his deposition in 1648. His reign is often cited as one of the most destructive in Ottoman history, characterized by erratic behavior, cruelty, and poor governance, which weakened the empire significantly during a critical period. Sultan Ibrahim's early life was marked by trauma. He spent much of his youth confined in the palace, fearing execution, as Ottoman succession practices were brutal. This isolation damaged his mental health, and when he finally became sultan after the death of his brother, Murad IV, he was psychologically unstable and ill-prepared to rule. At first, he relied on his mother, Kozum Sultan, and competent viziers, but soon his erratic decisions overwhelmed any stability. His rule was dominated by extravagant spending and debauchery. Ibrahim was obsessed with women, reportedly maintaining a harem of hundreds and indulging in excesses that drained the treasury. He lavished wealth on favorites and courtiers, while neglecting military and administrative responsibilities. The empire's finances collapsed under his wasteful projects, including extravagant palace renovations and frivolous luxuries. Politically, Ibrahim proved disastrous. He appointed corrupt officials, often based on personal favoritism rather than competence. His paranoia led to him ordering the execution of high-ranking officers and even his own concubines. He famously drowned 280 women from his harem, accused without evidence of infidelity. Such cruelty alienated both the court and the military. Externally, the empire faltered under his leadership. Military campaigns against Venice, particularly in Crete, became bogged down, draining resources without decisive victories. The Janissaries, long the backbone of Ottoman military power, grew restless due to poor unpaid wages and poor leadership, further destabilizing the empire. Eventually, his misrule proved too much. In 1648, a coalition of soldiers, scholars, and officials deposed him. He was imprisoned and later strangled, marking a violent end to a disastrous reign. Ibrahim exemplified how personal instability at the top could undermine an empire as vast and complex as the Ottoman.
18. Ludwig II of Bavaria, 1845 to 1886. Ludwig II of Bavaria, sometimes called the fairy tale king, is remembered today for the stunning castles he built, including Neuschwanstein, which inspired Disney. While admired for his romantic vision, his reign as king from 1864 to 1886 is also a cautionary tale of how obsession, detachment, and mismanagement can undermine a monarch's rule. Ludwig ascended the throne at just 18, inexperienced and unprepared for leadership. He quickly distanced himself from politics, preferring art, architecture, and fantasy. He idolized composer Richard Wagner, becoming his patron and pouring vast sums of public money into Wagner's operas. Though this enriched German culture, Ludwig's excessive spending created immense financial strain on Bavaria. The king's passion for grandiose building projects consumed the kingdom's resources. He constructed elaborate castles, designed more for personal escapism than governance. These projects, including Neuschwanstein, Linderhof, and Herrenchiemsee, cost far beyond the Bavarian state's means. As debts mounted, ministers and advisors grew increasingly frustrated with Ludwig's disregard for fiscal responsibility. Politically, Ludwig proved detached. Bavaria was caught between larger powers like Austria and Prussia, and its sovereignty was fragile. Ludwig failed to assert Bavaria's independence effectively, and his lack of engagement left the kingdom vulnerable to Prussian dominance. Following the Austro-Prussian War, Bavaria became part of the German Empire under Prussian leadership, diminishing its autonomy. Ludwig played little role in these critical events, distracted by his fantasies. His eccentricity worsened with time. He avoided public appearances, preferring to wander his castles at night and immerse himself in imagined medieval worlds. Rumors of his instability grew, and officials worried he could no longer rule effectively. In 1886, he was declared insane and deposed. Days later, he was found dead in Lake Starnberg under mysterious circumstances alongside his psychiatrist. Whether suicide or conspiracy remains debated. Ludwig II is a paradox. Beloved today for the beauty of his castles, but in life he was seen as a failure who drained Bavaria's treasury, neglected politics, and left his kingdom weaker. His reign demonstrates how detachment from reality, even when expressed through art, can ruin effective governance. 19. Emperor Yang of Sui China, 569 to 618. Emperor Yang of the Sui dynasty ruled from 604 to 618 and is widely condemned as one of China's most tyrannical rulers. His reign was marked by massive construction projects, extravagant displays of power, and costly military campaigns, all of which exhausted the state and contributed to the dynasty's collapse. Yang inherited a unified China from his father, Emperor Wen, whose reforms and campaigns had stabilized the realm. However, Yang squandered this foundation. He embarked on massive building projects, including the completion of the Grand Canal, which linked northern and southern China. While the canal became an enduring achievement, its construction required immense forced labor, causing suffering and resentment among the peasantry. Hundreds of thousands reportedly died during its creation. Yang's extravagance was legendary. He built luxurious palaces, expanded the imperial court, and staged elaborate tours of the empire, which drained the treasury. These displays alienated commoners who bore the tax burden, and nobles who saw his excess as irresponsible. His military campaigns launched disastrous campaigns, particularly against Goguryeo, Korea. These wars consumed resources and manpower but achieved little. Defeats demoralized the army and undermined confidence in his rule. Soldiers and generals grew resentful, sparking rebellions across the empire. His authoritarian rule exacerbated unrest. Yang demanded absolute obedience, executed dissenters, and enforced strict labor levies. The people, exhausted by forced labor and heavy taxation, began to revolt. Widespread uprisings spread, eroding the Sui dynasty's stability. By 618, rebellion engulfed China, and Yang was assassinated by his own officials. His death marked the end of the Sui dynasty, which lasted barely 37 years. Emperor Yang's reign is often studied as an example of how over-ambition and tyranny can destroy a dynasty. Though the Grand Canal remains a vital achievement, the human cost and political instability it caused highlight the destructive consequences of his misrule. 19. Richard II of England, 1367 to 1400. Richard II ruled England from 1377 to 1399 and is remembered as a monarch whose arrogance, favoritism, and authoritarian tendencies alienated his subjects and nobles, ultimately leading to his downfall. Though intelligent and cultured, his poor leadership and inability to manage political crises made him one of England's least effective kings. Richard ascended the throne at 10 during the 100 Years' War, with regents governing in his name. Early in his reign, England faced the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, a major uprising driven by economic hardship and resentment of taxation. Richard showed initial courage, personally confronting rebels, but his promises of reform were quickly broken, leading to widespread mistrust. As he matured, Richard relied heavily on favorites, alienating the nobility. His lavish spending on art and personal luxuries strained the treasury. He pursued peace with France, which, though reasonable, angered nobles who favored war for honor and plunder. His court became divided, with factions vying for power. Richard's authoritarian streak grew with time. He increasingly sidelined Parliament, imposed heavy taxes, and punished critics harshly. He ordered the execution or exile of powerful nobles, creating deep resentment. His attempt to establish near-absolute rule clashed with England's tradition of shared governance between king and parliament. In 1397, Richard moved against his rivals in what became known as the tyranny. He arrested and executed leading nobles, consolidating power but deepening opposition. His arrogance and detachment made him widely unpopular. When his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, later Henry IV, returned from exile to claim his inheritance, Richard's lack of support was evident. He was deposed in 1399 and imprisoned, where he died under mysterious circumstances the following year. Richard II's reign demonstrates how personal arrogance and poor political judgment can undermine even a capable ruler. Though he patronized the arts and fostered cultural growth, his failure to govern responsibly plunged England into instability, paving the way for the Wars of the Roses in the following century.
Number 21. King Edward II of England, 1284 to 1327. Edward II is remembered as one of England's weakest and most disastrous monarchs. Unlike his father, Edward I, who was known as a warrior king and a capable ruler, Edward II had little interest in governance or military leadership. He was more interested in leisure activities such as rowing and carpentry, which made the nobles consider him unfit for kingship. His reign was marked by favoritism, mismanagement, and military disasters that weakened the English crown. One of Edward's most notorious flaws was his reliance on a small circle of personal favorites, particularly Piers Gaveston. Edward showered Gaveston with lands, wealth, and titles, alienating the nobility who believed that governance should be a shared responsibility. The barons saw Gaveston as arrogant and manipulative, and Edward's refusal to heed their grievances led to civil strife. The barons forced Gaveston's exile multiple times, yet Edward continually reinstated him. Eventually, the nobles captured Gaveston and executed him without royal consent, an act that further humiliated Edward and revealed his inability to control his kingdom. Militarily, Edward's reign was catastrophic. The most infamous example was the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, where the Scots, under Robert the Bruce, crushed the English army. Edward personally led his forces, but showed cowardice in battle and fled the field, leaving thousands of his soldiers to be slaughtered. This defeat secured Scotland's independence and severely damaged England's prestige. Edward's failure to defend English interests made him a laughingstock across Europe. Edward also demonstrated gross incompetence in managing the kingdom's finances. His lavish spending on favorites drained the royal treasury. Meanwhile, the common people suffered from famine and economic hardship in the early 13th century, yet Edward did little to alleviate their struggles. Instead, he imposed heavy taxes that further angered the population. His misrule culminated in civil war. The nobles, led by his wife, Queen Isabella, and her lover, Roger Mortimer, invaded England in 1326. Edward was abandoned by his supporters, captured, and forced to abdicate in favor of his young son, Edward III. His ignominious end came in 1327, when he was murdered in Berkeley Castle, allegedly with extreme brutality. Edward II's legacy is one of weakness,
favoritism, and incompetence. He failed in almost every responsibility of kingship: military defense, political unity, financial stability, and moral authority. His disastrous reign is often considered a warning of what happens when personal indulgence and misplaced loyalty outweigh the duties of leadership. Number 22. King Louis XVI of France, 1754 to 1793. Louis XVI's reign represents one of the most disastrous failures in European history, as his indecision and incompetence played a central role in sparking the French Revolution and bringing down the monarchy. Though not a cruel tyrant in the traditional sense, Louis's weakness and inability to act decisively in the face of crisis doomed France and himself. When Louis ascended the throne in 1774, France was already drowning in debt. His predecessors had spent extravagantly on wars and luxury, but Louis continued the pattern by financially supporting the American Revolution against Britain. This drained French resources further without providing meaningful returns. Instead of implementing bold reforms to save the economy, Louis dithered, alternating between half-hearted reforms and reactionary policies that pleased no one. Louis's extravagance at Versailles also made him a symbol of royal excess. He and Queen Marie Antoinette lived in opulence while the French people faced food shortages and famine. Antoinette's frivolous spending earned her the nickname Madame Deficit. But Louis was equally guilty of indulging in hunting and personal hobbies while ignoring the cries of his starving subjects. Politically, he lacked the decisiveness needed to confront the crisis. When the Estates General met in 1789, Louis vacillated between granting concessions and attempting repression. His inability to choose a consistent course emboldened the revolutionaries. Instead of reforming taxation to make the nobility and clergy pay their share, he clung to outdated privileges, angering the Third Estate. His poor judgment culminated in the storming of the Bastille and the beginning of full-scale revolution. His greatest blunder came in 1791, when he attempted to flee Paris during the revolution. His escape plan, known as the Flight to Varennes, failed miserably, and he was captured. This act destroyed any remaining trust between him and the people. By abandoning the capital, he confirmed suspicions that he sought international intervention against his own subjects. His final downfall came during the French Revolutionary Wars. He was accused of conspiring with Austria and other monarchs to restore his absolute power. His trial in 1792 revealed his duplicity, and he was convicted of treason. In January 1793, he was executed by guillotine. Louis XVI is remembered not for cruelty, but for weakness, indecision, and failure to adapt. His incompetence destroyed centuries of French monarchy, plunged France into bloody revolution, and set the stage for Napoleon's rise. He stands as an example of how inaction can be as disastrous as tyranny. Number 23. King Henry VI of England, 1421 to 1471. Henry VI's reign was disastrous both for England and for the monarchy itself. Unlike strong rulers before him, Henry was weak, indecisive, and prone to mental illness, making him incapable of handling the burdens of kingship. His failures plunged England into the bloody civil conflict known as the Wars of the Roses. Henry inherited the throne as an infant, and during his minority, capable regents held the kingdom together. But once he assumed personal rule, Henry proved utterly unsuited for kingship. He was deeply pious, preferring prayer and religious study to governance. While admirable in personal life, this made him disastrously ineffective as a monarch, since he neglected the responsibilities of war, diplomacy, and justice. One of his greatest failures was losing most of England's French territories. Under his grandfather, Henry V, England had controlled large parts of France, but Henry VI's weakness and inability to command respect led to military collapse.
The decisive loss at the Battle of Castillon in 1453 marked the end of the Hundred Years' War and England's expulsion from France except for Calais. This humiliated the English nobility and eroded confidence in the crown. Henry's mental instability compounded the crisis. In 1453, he suffered a mental breakdown, during which he was catatonic and incapable of ruling for over a year. During these episodes, rival noble factions battled for control, plunging the kingdom into chaos. His inability to provide strong leadership fueled resentment and encouraged powerful nobles to pursue their own ambitions. His marriage to Margaret of Anjou also proved disastrous. Margaret was politically ambitious and acted as de facto ruler during Henry's incapacity, but her assertiveness alienated many nobles. She clashed with Richard the Duke of York, sparking open conflict. The Wars of the Roses devastated England, killing thousands and destabilizing the monarchy. Henry was repeatedly deposed and restored, but never commanded loyalty. Eventually, Edward IV, son of the Duke of York, captured him. In 1471, Henry was murdered in the Tower of London, likely on Edward's orders, ending his pitiful reign. Henry VI is remembered as a weak king, whose failures caused immense bloodshed. His inability to govern effectively, his loss of France, and his role in sparking civil war destroyed the stability of England for generations.
24. Emperor Commodus of Rome, 161 to 192. Few Roman emperors are as infamous as Commodus, whose reign marked the beginning of the decline of the Roman Empire. The son of Marcus Aurelius, one of Rome's greatest emperors, Commodus squandered his inheritance through vanity, cruelty, and neglect of governance. From the beginning, Commodus was more interested in luxury and personal amusement than ruling. He left much of the administration to corrupt favorites and freedmen, who exploited their positions to enrich themselves while neglecting the empire. Bribery, extortion, and incompetence flourished under his rule. Commodus himself indulged in bizarre behavior. He fancied himself the reincarnation of Hercules, dressing in lion skins and carrying a club. He even renamed Rome Colonia Commodina after himself, forcing people to worship him as a living god. Such vanity shocked Romans, who were accustomed to emperors displaying at least some humility in public life. His obsession with gladiatorial combat was another disgrace. Commodus frequently appeared in the arena fighting as a gladiator against helpless opponents. Although he claimed thousands of victories, these matches were staged and opponents were often crippled or armed with wooden weapons. He humiliated the Senate by forcing senators to watch him perform, undermining the dignity of the empire. Politically, his neglect led to widespread instability. Military commanders were alienated, and plots against him multiplied. Commodus responded with paranoia and cruelty, ordering executions of perceived enemies. His reign of terror created fear among nobles, but further weakened loyalty. Eventually, his bizarre behavior became intolerable even to his inner circle. In 192, a conspiracy of officials and his mistress had him strangled. His death ended the Nerva Antonine dynasty and plunged Rome into civil war known as the Year of the Five Emperors. Commodus is remembered as a vain, cruel, and incompetent ruler who turned the dignity of the Roman Empire into a personal circus. His reign marked the transition from Rome's golden age to centuries of decline. 25. King Philip III of Spain, 1578 to 1621. Philip III's reign is considered one of the weakest in Spanish history, a time when Spain's global power began to crumble. Unlike his father, Philip II, who personally managed the Spanish Empire, Philip III was lazy and uninterested in governance, preferring leisure and religious devotion to ruling effectively. Philip delegated most of his power to his favorite, the Duke of Lerma, whose corruption and greed drained the Spanish treasury.
Lerma enriched himself and his allies through bribes and the sale of offices while neglecting the empire's pressing problems. Spain faced mounting debt, inflation, and military overstretch, but little was done to address these issues. One of Philip's most infamous decisions was the expulsion of the Moriscos in 1609. The Moriscos, descendants of Muslims who had converted to Christianity, were accused of secretly practicing Islam. Philip ordered their mass expulsion, uprooting hundreds of thousands of people who contributed significantly to Spain's economy, especially in agriculture. This act weakened Spain's labor force, reduced tax revenues, and damaged its economy for decades. In foreign policy, Philip III continued costly wars against the Dutch and other European powers without achieving significant gains. His neglect of naval power allowed Spain's maritime supremacy to fade. Meanwhile, rival powers like England and the Netherlands grew stronger at Spain's expense. Domestically, Philip's court became notorious for extravagance and waste. While the treasury emptied, the king indulged in lavish entertainments and religious ceremonies. The people bore the burden of high taxes and inflation, leading to widespread discontent. Philip's personal passivity was his greatest flaw. He avoided decision-making and allowed Lerma to rule in his name for nearly 2 decades. Only later, when Lerma was disgraced, did Philip attempt to reassert control. But by then, Spain's decline was evident. Philip III's reign represents the failure of monarchy through neglect. His laziness, reliance on corrupt favorites, and disastrous decisions like the expulsion of the Moriscos weakened Spain irreversibly. He's remembered not for cruelty, but for incompetence and for presiding over the slow collapse of Spain's once mighty empire.
26. King James II of England, 1633 to 1701. James II is remembered as one of England's most disastrous monarchs, not because he was cruel in the mold of tyrants, but because his stubbornness, religious intolerance, and disregard for constitutional principles triggered a revolution that ended his reign. His failures were political and ideological, rooted in his inability to recognize the mood of his kingdom. From the start, James's open Catholicism was a problem. England was a Protestant nation, and while private Catholic sympathies among the nobility were tolerated, James openly practiced his faith and promoted Catholic interests. As king, he appointed Catholics to positions of power in government, the military, and universities, directly challenging laws designed to preserve Protestant dominance. This created widespread resentment and fear that he intended to restore Catholic absolutism. His authoritarian tendencies deepened the crisis. James ignored Parliament when it opposed his policies, ruling instead by royal decree. He suspended laws at will, particularly those restricting Catholic participation in public life, setting a dangerous precedent. His belief in divine right clashed with England's evolving constitutional framework, where Parliament was gaining power. James also mishandled the army. He created a standing force loyal to him personally, placing Catholic officers in command. This alarmed both Protestants and traditional nobles, who feared a permanent Catholic military dictatorship. Perhaps his greatest blunder was the Declaration of Indulgence in 1687, which granted religious freedom not only to Catholics but also to Protestant dissenters. While on the surface this seemed progressive, many saw it as a cynical move to undermine the Church of England and increase Catholic influence. James compounded the mistake by demanding that clergy read the declaration from their pulpits, sparking outrage among Anglican bishops. The final straw was the birth of his son in 1688, which raised the prospect of a permanent Catholic dynasty. Until then, many had tolerated James, hoping his Protestant daughter Mary would succeed him. But the new heir shattered that hope. A group of nobles invited Mary's husband, William of Orange, to invade. When William landed, James found himself deserted by his army and allies. He fled to France, effectively abdicating. James spent the rest of his life in exile, plotting to regain the throne, but failing in attempts like the Jacobite uprisings. His reign was remembered as a cautionary tale of arrogance, religious favoritism, and disregard for the nation's values. By clinging stubbornly to Catholic absolutism, he destroyed his own dynasty and ensured that Parliament supremacy would define English politics thereafter. 27. King Charles VI of France, 1368 to 1422. King Charles VI of France, often called Charles the Mad, was one of the most disastrous monarchs in French history. His reign combined personal mental illness with political incompetence, plunging France into chaos during the 100 Years' War. At first, Charles showed promise. Early in his reign, he was nicknamed Charles the Well-Beloved. But in 1392, he suffered his first bout of madness, attacking his own companions in a paranoid frenzy. From then on, his episodes grew worse, leaving him catatonic or delusional for long periods. Sometimes he forgot he was king or believed he was made of glass. These incapacities left France without effective leadership. His illness created a power vacuum exploited by rival factions. The Dukes of Burgundy and Orleans vied for control of the government, turning the kingdom into a battleground for their personal ambitions. The Burgundians eventually orchestrated the assassination of Louis of Orleans in 1407, escalating the Civil War. Instead of uniting against England, France was consumed by internal strife. Charles's inability to rule also weakened France militarily. The English took advantage of the chaos, winning crushing victories such as Agincourt in 1415. French forces were humiliated and the country descended into despair. One of the worst consequences of Charles's reign was the Treaty of Troyes in 1420. With Charles incapacitated, his wife Queen Isabel and the Burgundians agreed to disinherit the Dauphin, the future Charles VII, and recognize England's Henry V as heir to the French throne. This humiliating agreement nearly destroyed French sovereignty, effectively handing the kingdom to a foreign power. Domestically, Charles's illness led to corruption and mismanagement. His court was notorious for extravagance, while the population suffered from war, famine, and taxation. Queen Isabel was accused of adultery and greed, further tarnishing the monarchy's reputation. By the time Charles died in 1422, France was divided, impoverished, and partially occupied by the English. His reign was remembered as one of incompetence and tragedy. Though his madness was not his fault, his inability to govern and the chaos it caused made him one of history's worst kings.
28. King Henry VIII of England, 1491 to 1547. Henry VIII is infamous not only for his 6 marriages, but for his tyranny, cruelty, and destructive policies. Though he strengthened the monarchy in some ways, his legacy is overshadowed by bloodshed, religious upheaval, and personal excess. Henry's obsession with producing a male heir drove much of his misrule. When the Pope refused to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, Henry broke with Rome and declared himself head of the Church of England. This act, driven by personal desire rather than reformist zeal, plunged England into decades of religious turmoil. Monasteries were dissolved, their wealth seized, and traditional Catholic practices suppressed. The dissolution destroyed centuries of cultural and charitable institutions, enriching Henry while leaving the poor without support. His marital history is equally notorious. Henry divorced or executed wives in his desperate quest for a son. Anne Boleyn was executed on trumped-up charges of adultery and incest. Jane Seymour died after childbirth. Anne of Cleves was discarded, and Catherine Howard was executed for alleged infidelity. These brutal acts revealed Henry's cruelty and volatility. Politically, Henry ruled through fear. He used charges of treason and heresy to eliminate opponents, often on flimsy evidence. Prominent figures like Thomas More and Thomas Cromwell were executed for failing to please him. His paranoia created an atmosphere of terror in court. Economically, Henry squandered the wealth he gained from the monasteries on wars and personal extravagance.
His military campaigns in France were costly and largely unsuccessful, draining the treasury. Inflation soared, and ordinary people bore the burden through taxation. Henry also grew increasingly tyrannical in his later years. Obese, paranoid, and cruel, he executed even close friends and family members. His reign left England religiously divided, financially weakened, and politically unstable. Though he centralized royal authority, Henry VIII's reign is remembered more for blood and chaos than achievement. His cruelty, religious destruction, and selfishness make him one of England's worst monarchs. 29. King Antiochus IV Epiphanes of the Seleucid Empire. Antiochus IV Epiphanes of the Seleucid Empire is remembered as a tyrant whose oppressive policies provoked the Maccabean revolt and destabilized his kingdom. Though he considered himself a divine ruler, history remembers him for cruelty, arrogance, and disastrous religious intolerance. Antiochus came to power in 175 BC and quickly adopted the title Epiphanes, meaning God manifest. His subjects, however, nicknamed him Epimanes, or the madman, due to his erratic and eccentric behavior. He demanded worship as a living god, shocking both Greeks and Jews under his rule. One of his most infamous acts was his harsh suppression of Jewish religious practices. In an attempt to Hellenize his subjects, Antiochus banned circumcision, Sabbath observance, and Jewish dietary laws. He desecrated the Jewish temple in Jerusalem by installing an altar to Zeus and sacrificing pigs there, an unthinkable blasphemy to the Jewish people. His persecution was brutal, with executions, forced conversions, and the destruction of sacred texts. These actions provoked the Maccabean Revolt, a Jewish uprising that challenged Seleucid rule. The revolt drained resources and exposed Antiochus's weakness as he failed to suppress it effectively. Instead of consolidating his empire, he fractured it through intolerance. Antiochus also pursued reckless military campaigns. He attempted to expand into Egypt, but was forced to withdraw when Rome intervened, humiliating him. His ambitions outstripped his capabilities, leaving his empire weakened. His reign ended in failure. Antiochus died during a campaign in Persia, leaving behind a fractured and unstable empire. His policies not only alienated his subjects, but also destroyed the Seleucid dynasty's authority in Judea. Antiochus IV is remembered as arrogant, intolerant, and destructive. His cruelty and religious persecution made him a hated figure in history, and his misrule weakened one of the great Hellenistic empires.
30. King Charles of England, 1600 to 1649. Charles I's reign ended in civil war and his execution, making him one of England's most notorious monarchs. His stubborn belief in absolute monarchy, disregard for Parliament, and failure to compromise plunged the kingdom into chaos. From the beginning, Charles clashed with Parliament over money and power. He believed in the divine right of kings and ruled without Parliament for 11 years, raising money through unpopular taxes such as ship money. This autocratic style alienated his subjects, who saw him as trampling on their rights. Religiously, Charles provoked anger by supporting Archbishop Laud's reforms, which many believed resembled Catholic practices. His marriage to a Catholic queen, Henrietta Maria of France, fueled suspicions that he sought to restore Catholicism. These fears turned much of Protestant England against him. When Parliament resisted his demands, Charles resorted to arresting opponents and dissolving sessions. His inflexibility destroyed trust and made compromise impossible. Eventually, tensions erupted in the English Civil War in 1642. Charles proved an incompetent war leader. His forces were poorly managed, and his failure to secure consistent victories doomed his cause. Meanwhile, the parliamentarians under Oliver Cromwell grew stronger. Even after capture, Charles's arrogance prevented resolution. He conspired with the Scots to reignite conflict, showing bad faith. This led to renewed bloodshed in the Second Civil War. In 1649, Charles was tried and convicted of treason against his people. He was executed, the first English monarch to suffer such a fate. His death shocked Europe and marked a turning point in limiting royal power. Charles is remembered as stubborn, arrogant, and disastrously inflexible. By refusing compromise, he destroyed his own monarchy and caused a bloody civil war that scarred England for generations.
31. King George III of England, 1738 to 1820. George III's reign is one of the most infamous in British history, remembered above all for the loss of the American colonies and for his debilitating mental illness that left the kingdom leaderless during crucial years. While he was not deliberately cruel, his stubbornness, short-sightedness, and inability to adapt to change led to disasters that reshaped the world. From the outset, George was determined to be a moral and active king, unlike his Hanoverian predecessors. But his sense of duty quickly became stubborn interference in government. He frequently dismissed ministers, imposed his will on Parliament, and tried to control policy far more than was advisable. His insistence on absolute authority clashed with the growing spirit of parliamentary governance. His handling of the American colonies is the clearest example of his failings. After Britain's victory in the 7 Years' War, the government sought to tax the colonies to pay for defense. George supported measures like the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts, believing strongly in Parliament's right to tax the colonies. When protests erupted, he backed harsher enforcement rather than compromise. His refusal to consider colonial grievances turned discontent into outright rebellion. During the American Revolutionary War, George demanded total victory, rejecting conciliatory proposals. Even as the war turned against Britain, he insisted on continuing until the humiliating defeat at Yorktown in 1781. His stubbornness wasted lives, resources, and ultimately resulted in Britain losing its most valuable colonies. George's reign was also marred by his mental illness, now thought to be either bipolar disorder or porphyria. He suffered prolonged episodes of madness during which he babbled incoherently, shouted uncontrollably, or could not recognize those around him. These breakdowns left Britain without effective leadership at critical times, including during the Napoleonic Wars. For much of the latter part of his reign, his son ruled as Prince Regent. Although George was personally frugal and devout, his inability to delegate power effectively and his insistence on controlling politics made his reign unstable. His failures in America cost Britain global dominance, and his madness left the monarchy in chaos. George III is remembered as a well-meaning but disastrously stubborn and ineffective king. His failures altered world history, proving how personal rigidity at the top can change the fate of nations. 32. Emperor Maximilian of Mexico, 1832 to 1867. Maximilian's reign as Emperor of Mexico was short, disastrous, and tragic. Installed by French Emperor Napoleon III in 1864, Maximilian was an outsider with little understanding of Mexico's politics or culture. His inability to secure legitimacy and his naive idealism ensured his reign ended in blood. Maximilian, an Austrian archduke, accepted the throne believing he could bring progress and stability. But his empire was built on foreign bayonets. French troops had invaded Mexico after the country defaulted on European debts, and Napoleon III saw an opportunity to establish a puppet regime. Mexican conservatives supported the plan, hoping Maximilian would restore traditional privileges. From the start, Maximilian was doomed. Most Mexicans supported the Republican forces of Benito Juárez, who resisted foreign intervention. Maximilian tried to present himself as a reformer, introducing laws to protect peasants and limit forced labor. Ironically, these liberal policies alienated the conservative elites who had invited him in the first place. His biggest weakness was his reliance on French support. When Napoleon III withdrew troops in 1866 under U.S. pressure, Maximilian was left exposed. Lacking a strong army or popular support, he faced inevitable defeat. Instead of fleeing, Maximilian chose to stay, claiming he would not abandon his people. This decision, more romantic than rational, sealed his fate. Republican forces captured him in 1867. Despite pleas for mercy from European monarchs, he was executed by firing squad, becoming a symbol of foreign folly. Maximilian's reign was disastrous because it was illegitimate from the start. He was a foreign ruler imposed on a proud and independent nation. His failure to understand Mexican politics, his dependence on French arms, and his naive decisions made him an object of ridicule. Though personally cultured and well-meaning, history remembers him as a weak and deluded puppet whose reign ended in catastrophe.
33. King John II of France, 1319 to 1364. John II of France, known as John the Good, is remembered ironically, as his reign was marked by military defeats, financial ruin, and personal incompetence. His failures during the 100 Years' War deepened France's suffering and humiliation. John inherited a difficult situation, but his leadership worsened it. Militarily, he was reckless and poorly prepared. The defining disaster of his reign was the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, where the English army, under the Black Prince, crushed the French. John himself was captured, an unprecedented humiliation for a king. His capture threw France into chaos, with his son Charles forced to govern as regent while the English demanded massive ransoms. To secure his release, John agreed to the Treaty of Bretigny in 1360, which ceded vast French territories to England and required an enormous ransom. The cost crippled the French economy, forcing crushing taxes on the population. Resentment boiled over in revolts such as the Jacquerie, a peasant uprising brutally suppressed but never forgotten. John's personal character worsened matters. He indulged in luxury and extravagance even while his kingdom bled. His poor judgment was evident when he voluntarily returned to English captivity in 1364 after one of his sons, held as a hostage, escaped. While this act might be seen as honorable, it was politically idiotic, leaving France leaderless again. He died in London that same year, leaving his kingdom weakened and humiliated. His reign represents one of the lowest points in French history, remembered for defeat, humiliation, and poor leadership. Despite his nickname, John II was anything but good. 34. King Louis XVIII of France, 1755 to 1824. Louis XVIII, restored to the throne after Napoleon's defeat, is remembered as weak, indecisive, and reactionary. His reign highlighted the inability of the Bourbon monarchy to adapt to modern political realities, paving the way for its ultimate downfall. Louis spent years in exile during the Revolution and Napoleonic Wars. When restored in 1814, he faced a divided nation: royalists who wanted to restore absolute monarchy, liberals who wanted constitutional freedoms, and Bonapartists loyal to Napoleon. Louis tried to balance these factions but pleased none. He agreed to a constitutional charter that limited royal power, but he undermined it whenever possible, restoring privileges to the nobility and clergy. His government became a battleground between reactionary ministers and moderates, creating instability. His biggest humiliation came in 1815 during the 100 Days. When Napoleon escaped exile and marched on Paris, Louis fled without resistance. Napoleon regained power effortlessly, while Louis appeared cowardly and weak. Only Napoleon's final defeat at Waterloo allowed him to return. Louis's court was notorious for corruption, nepotism, and waste. He relied heavily on his brother, the future Charles X, whose ultra-conservative policies alienated the population. Meanwhile, Louis himself grew obese and inactive, uninterested in governance. By the time of his death in 1824, Louis had failed to reconcile France's divisions. His reign exposed the fragility of Bourbon rule and set the stage for further turmoil. He is remembered as a weak monarch who returned France to reaction without providing stability or progress.
35. King Afonso V of Portugal, 1432 to 1481. Afonso V of Portugal, nicknamed the African, is remembered as one of Portugal's least effective monarchs. Though he sought glory through military campaigns, his neglect of domestic reform and reckless wars weakened his kingdom. Afonso focused much of his reign on North Africa, launching costly expeditions to conquer Muslim territories. While he achieved some victories, such as the capture of Alcácer Seguer, these campaigns drained Portugal's resources without providing lasting benefits. His obsession with African conquests distracted him from pressing issues at home. He also embroiled Portugal in dynastic wars in Castile. After the death of Castile's king, Afonso married his niece, Joanna, and invaded Castile to claim the throne. The campaign was disastrous, culminating in defeat at the Battle of Toro in 1476. Though the battle was technically indecisive, politically it ruined Afonso's ambitions. Domestically, Afonso failed to curb noble power or implement reforms. Instead, he relied on aristocratic support for his military adventures, giving them greater influence at the expense of royal authority. The economy stagnated under heavy taxation, and the population suffered from neglect. In his later years, Afonso even abdicated temporarily in favor of his son, John II, showing his exhaustion and lack of will to govern. He eventually resumed the throne, but accomplished little thereafter. Afonso's reign is remembered as a period of wasted opportunities. While Portugal's explorers began their journeys along the African coast, Afonso himself focused on costly wars that drained the kingdom. His legacy is one of overreach, incompetence, and failure to strengthen Portugal at a crucial moment in its history. 36. Emperor Valentinian III of Rome, 419 to 455. Valentinian III's reign represents the tragic collapse of the Western Roman Empire into chaos, corruption, and foreign domination. He ascended to the throne as a child, manipulated by his ambitious mother, Galla Placidia, and powerful generals. Unfortunately, when he reached adulthood, Valentinian proved utterly incapable of leadership. One of his greatest failings was his reliance on corrupt and incompetent advisors. Rather than governing wisely, he spent his reign indulging in luxury, idleness, and petty intrigues. While Rome's enemies grew stronger, Valentinian wasted precious years on palace politics. He became dependent on generals such as Flavius Aetius, the only competent commander who kept the empire afloat. Valentinian's cowardice and paranoia sealed his ruin. In 454, in an act of treachery, he personally murdered Aetius, stabbing him during a meeting. This reckless act destroyed the empire's last hope of military stability. With Aetius dead, Rome was defenseless against barbarian invasions. The consequences came swiftly. In 455, the Vandals, under King Genseric, sacked Rome, looting the city for 2 weeks. This disaster symbolized the empire's helplessness, and it occurred under Valentinian's watch. His inability to lead, compounded by his betrayal of Aetius, directly caused this humiliation. Valentinian himself met a violent end. Shortly after Aetius's murder, he was assassinated by loyalists of the slain general. His reign is remembered as a time of cowardice, incompetence, and betrayal, marking one of the final nails in the coffin of the Western Roman Empire. 37. Peter III of Russia, 1728 to 1762. Peter III of Russia, though he reigned for only 6 months, managed to alienate nearly every segment of Russian society. His incompetence, reckless decisions, and obsession with Prussia made him one of Russia's most despised rulers. Peter was born in Germany and never fully embraced Russian culture. He struggled with the Russian language and showed disdain for local traditions, making him appear as a foreigner ruling an unwilling people. His obsession with all things German made him deeply unpopular among nobles and the military. One of his most notorious acts was ending Russia's participation in the 7 Years' War. Despite Russia being on the verge of victory over Prussia, Peter, an admirer of Frederick the Great, immediately reversed alliances and made peace. He even offered Prussia territory Russia had gained during the war. This betrayal infuriated the army, which had sacrificed so much during the war. Domestically, Peter pursued reforms that alienated nearly everyone. He offended the powerful Orthodox Church by seizing church property. He angered nobles by planning to free serfs who worked on their estates, while simultaneously alienating peasants by favoring German officers and policies. Peter's personal behavior was equally disgraceful. He was described as childish, immature, and more interested in playing with toy soldiers than governing. His cruelty and drunken outbursts alienated his wife, the future Catherine the Great, who plotted against him.
38. Umberto of Italy, 1844 to 1900. King Umberto of Italy is remembered as a reactionary monarch whose policies and indifference to suffering earned him the nickname the King of the Slaughter. His reign, 1878 to 1900, highlighted the deep divisions and instability of newly unified Italy. Umberto came to power determined to strengthen the monarchy and suppress dissent. Unfortunately, he pursued authoritarian policies that alienated the working class and fueled unrest. Strikes and protests were frequent in late 19th century Italy, driven by poverty and inequality. Instead of addressing grievances, Umberto relied on violent repression. The worst example was the Bava Beccaris massacre in Milan in 1898. When protests broke out over bread shortages, General Bava Beccaris ordered troops to fire on demonstrators, killing hundreds. Rather than condemning the brutality, Umberto praised the general and awarded him honors. This callousness made him a symbol of royal indifference to the suffering of ordinary Italians. Umberto also supported costly colonial adventures in Africa, which ended in disaster. The humiliating defeat at the Battle of Adwa in 1896, where Ethiopian forces crushed the Italian army, exposed the weakness of Italy's ambitions and deepened resentment at home. His political style was rigid and outdated. He refused to consider reforms or compromise with liberal forces, relying instead on military power and conservative elites. This created an atmosphere of repression and discontent that fueled revolutionary movements. In 1900, Umberto's arrogance cost him his life. An anarchist, Gaetano Bresci, assassinated him in Monza as revenge for the massacre in Milan. His death symbolized the anger he inspired among the oppressed. Umberto's legacy is one of repression, incompetence, and cruelty. Instead of guiding Italy through its early years of unity, he deepened divisions and left behind a legacy of bloodshed. 39. King Otho of Greece, 1815 to 1867. Otho of Greece, the first modern king of an independent Greece, is remembered as a foreign monarch who never understood his people and whose incompetence nearly destroyed the fragile new state. A Bavarian prince, Otho was chosen as king in 1832, after the Greek War of Independence.
But instead of embracing Greek culture, he surrounded himself with Bavarian advisors and imposed foreign customs, alienating the very people he was supposed to rule. He even refused to convert from Catholicism to Orthodoxy, further straining relations with his subjects. Otho ruled as an absolute monarch at first, ignoring demands for a constitution. His government was dominated by corruption and inefficiency. Public offices were handed out to foreigners or cronies, while Greek leaders who had fought for independence were sidelined. The economy stagnated under his rule. Heavy taxation and mismanagement left the population impoverished, while Otho wasted money on palaces and luxuries. His lack of understanding of Greek society bred resentment. When pressured into granting a constitution in 1844, Otho still clung to power, undermining democratic institutions. He remained disconnected from political realities and never gained true legitimacy. His greatest failure was his inability to produce an heir with his wife, Queen Amelia. This created instability, as Greeks feared the throne would pass back to foreign hands. His attempts at expansion, including meddling in conflicts with the Ottoman Empire, were reckless and failed to achieve results. By 1862, popular anger boiled over. Otho was overthrown in a military revolt and forced into exile. He lived the rest of his life in obscurity in Bavaria. Otho's reign is remembered as a period of disappointment. He was a foreigner who never earned the trust of his people, squandered resources, and failed to establish stability in a new nation. His incompetence and arrogance made him one of Greece's most unpopular monarchs. 40. Nicholas II of Russia, 1868 to 1918. Nicholas II, the last Tsar of Russia, is one of history's most infamous monarchs. His reign was marked by arrogance, incompetence, and failure to address the massive challenges facing his empire. His actions and inaction led directly to revolution, civil war, and the destruction of the Romanov dynasty. From the beginning, Nicholas was ill-prepared for rule. He admitted himself that he never wanted to be Tsar and had little understanding of government. Yet he clung stubbornly to absolute power, refusing to allow meaningful reforms. One of his earliest disasters was the Russo-Japanese War, 1904 to 1905. Believing Russia could easily defeat Japan, Nicholas launched the conflict to expand influence in Asia. Instead, Russia suffered humiliating defeats, including the destruction of its navy. The war revealed the incompetence of Russia's leadership and fueled domestic unrest. The anger exploded in the 1905 revolution, when peaceful protesters marching in St. Petersburg were massacred by soldiers in the event known as Bloody Sunday. Nicholas's refusal to accept responsibility shattered his image as the little father of the people. Though he granted a constitution and parliament, the Duma, he quickly undermined them, proving he had no intention of sharing power. His greatest failure came during World War I. Nicholas took personal command of the army in 1915, despite having no military expertise. Russian forces suffered catastrophic losses, while food shortages and economic collapse devastated the home front. His absence from the capital allowed his wife Alexandra and the mystic Rasputin to dominate politics, fueling scandal and destroying public trust. By 1917, anger boiled over in the February Revolution. Nicholas was forced to abdicate, ending 300 years of Romanov rule. His attempt to cling to absolute power in the face of modern challenges destroyed the monarchy. Nicholas and his family were executed by the Bolsheviks in 1918. His reign is remembered as a tragic failure. A weak, stubborn ruler who failed his people, caused immense suffering, and paved the way for one of the most violent revolutions in history.
41. Focus of Byzantium, 602 to 610. The reign of Phocas is often remembered as one of the darkest chapters in the history of the Eastern Roman Empire. He rose to power not through legitimacy or merit, but through bloodshed, when he led a rebellion against Emperor Maurice and had him and his family slaughtered. This act alone stained his rule from the very beginning, as it was not just political upheaval, but an act of cruelty that shocked the empire. Phocas quickly proved unfit to guide a state that needed strong direction. Instead of bringing stability, his years in power were filled with corruption, brutality, and disastrous decisions that left the empire weak and vulnerable. He had little interest in improving the government or addressing the needs of the people. His attention was fixed on eliminating rivals, punishing critics, and enriching himself and his allies. One of his worst legacies was the empire's decline in the face of foreign threats. The Persians, enraged by the murder of Maurice, who had once been their ally, launched devastating invasions during Phocas's rule. Cities were burned, land was lost, and the empire's defenses collapsed. Instead of rallying his forces, Phocas spent his energy punishing officers he didn't trust, which destroyed morale in the army. Soldiers deserted, generals turned against him, and the borders fell into chaos. Life in the capital was equally grim. Phocas became notorious for cruelty. Executions were public and excessive, often targeting innocent people accused of plotting against him. Fear ruled Constantinople, with citizens whispering in private and dreading the attention of imperial spies. His inability to inspire loyalty led to constant unrest. By the time Heraclius, a governor's son, rose in rebellion, Phocas was so hated that many welcomed the change. When Heraclius entered Constantinople in 610, Phocas was captured. Accounts say that when he was brought before Heraclius and asked what kind of rule he had given the empire, Phocas snarled defiantly. That arrogance was his last act before being brutally executed. Phocas is remembered not for achievements, but for presiding over years of decline and cruelty. He rose through violence, governed through fear, and left behind only destruction. His reign weakened the empire so badly that it struggled for decades to recover, making him one of the worst rulers of the Byzantine world.
42. Louis II of Hungary, 1516 to 1526. Louis II became king of Hungary and Bohemia as a child, but by the time he reached adulthood, the realms he ruled were in desperate need of strong leadership. Instead, his short reign ended in disaster, with his kingdom torn apart and much of Hungary falling under Ottoman control. Louis was more interested in personal pleasures than in the responsibilities of rule. He spent lavishly on luxuries while neglecting the urgent need to strengthen defenses against the growing power of the Ottoman Empire. The treasury emptied as the nobility enriched themselves, and no serious attempt was made to reform the army or prepare the population for the danger on the horizon. When Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent advanced into Hungary in 1526, Louis was completely unprepared. Instead of carefully planning his defense, he rushed headlong into battle at Mohas with a poorly organized and badly equipped force. The decision was reckless. His army, though brave, was no match for the disciplined and well-supplied Ottoman troops. The battle turned into a massacre. Thousands of Hungarian soldiers were cut down, and the kingdom's leadership was shattered in one afternoon. Louis himself attempted to flee the battlefield, but drowned in a marsh when his horse stumbled. His death at only 20 years old symbolized the tragic end of an era. The consequences were catastrophic. Hungary was divided, with large portions falling under Ottoman control and others absorbed by the Habsburgs. The proud kingdom that had once stood as a bulwark of Christendom against Turkish expansion was reduced to a shadow of itself. Louis II's failures were not just military. His neglect of administration, his inability to restrain the nobility, and his lack of foresight left his kingdom vulnerable. Historians often call the Battle of Mohas the grave of Hungary, and Louis is remembered as the careless young king whose poor choices and lack of preparation brought ruin to his people. 43. Nero, 54 to 68 CE. Few rulers in history are as infamous as Nero, whose name has become a symbol of cruelty, excess, and neglect. Rising to power as a young man, Nero might have been shaped into a capable leader under the guidance of his early tutors, but instead he chose a path of indulgence and brutality. Nero's reign began with promise, but he quickly abandoned state affairs for personal pleasures. He fancied himself a musician and performer, spending vast sums on theatrical shows and forcing Rome's elite to attend his performances. He treated the empire as his stage, and the people were made unwilling spectators. His cruelty was unmatched. Nero ordered the murder of his own mother, Agrippina, who had helped secure his throne. He later killed his wife Octavia in cold blood. Friends and advisors who questioned him were executed or driven to suicide. Fear gripped the Senate, which became little more than a tool for his whims. The most infamous event of his reign was the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE. While historians debate whether Nero started the blaze, what is clear is his shameless behavior afterward. Instead of taking responsibility or helping the victims, he blamed the Christians, then a small and unpopular sect, and ordered horrific persecutions. Many were burned alive or torn apart by wild beasts, all to deflect attention from his failures. Nero's obsession with luxury drained the treasury. Heavy taxes and confiscations angered both rich and poor. Rebellions broke out in the provinces, including Gaul and Judea. Even his own army eventually turned against him. Declared an enemy of the state, Nero fled Rome. Abandoned by nearly everyone, he committed suicide in 68 CE, reportedly exclaiming, "What an artist dies in me."
44. Stephen of England, 1135 to 1154. Stephen of England's rule is best known for plunging the kingdom into one of the most chaotic and violent periods of the Middle Ages. His claim to the throne in 1135 sparked a civil war that lasted nearly 2 decades, remembered as the Anarchy. Stephen seized power after the death of King Henry I, despite Henry having named his daughter Matilda as heir. This act of usurpation set the stage for conflict. Many nobles supported Matilda's claim, while others backed Stephen, and the result was years of war that devastated England. Stephen was brave in battle, but lacked the political skill needed to hold the crown securely. He granted excessive favors to the barons in order to keep their loyalty, which weakened central authority. Castles sprung up across the land, often in the hands of lords who used them to terrorize the countryside. Chroniclers wrote of villages burned, crops stolen, and people left in misery as rival armies marched back and forth. The kingdom became a patchwork of shifting alliances. At times, Matilda gained the upper hand, even capturing Stephen in 1141, only to lose support due to her arrogance. Stephen eventually regained the throne, but the conflict dragged on with no clear resolution. By the end of his life, Stephen was forced to compromise. In 1153, he agreed that Matilda's son, Henry of Anjou, would inherit the throne. When Stephen died the next year, Henry became King Henry II, restoring order after nearly 20 years of chaos. Stephen is remembered not for cruelty or extravagance, but for weakness. His inability to secure loyalty, his poor decisions in rewarding barons, and his failure to bring peace left England in ruins. The anarchy scarred the nation, and Stephen's reign became a cautionary tale of how poor leadership can plunge a kingdom into disaster. 45. Caligula, 37 to 41 CE. Caligula, born Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, is one of the most notorious rulers in Roman history. His reign began with high hopes, but quickly descended into madness, cruelty, and excess. In just 4 years, he managed to leave a reputation so dark that his name still evokes images of tyranny. At first, Caligula was welcomed as a breath of fresh air after the grim rule of Tiberius. Crowds cheered him, and for a brief period he acted with generosity. But soon his behavior changed dramatically. Ancient sources describe him as falling into delusion, convinced of his own divinity and obsessed with humiliating the Senate and nobility. Caligula indulged in shocking extravagances. He built lavish palaces, staged costly games, and demanded adoration as a living god. He is said to have dressed as gods and goddesses, and even ordered temples to be built in his honor. To fund his excess, he imposed crushing taxes and confiscated the fortunes of wealthy citizens, leaving resentment across the empire. His cruelty was just as infamous. Executions were ordered on a whim. He mocked victims as they died and took pleasure in causing suffering. Stories circulated of him forcing parents to watch their children executed or humiliating senators in public. Perhaps the most bizarre tale is his reported plan to make his favorite horse, Incitatus, a consul. While some argue this was satire meant to insult the Senate, it revealed Caligula's contempt for Rome's institutions. Eventually, his own guards turned against him. In 41 CE, Caligula was assassinated in a palace conspiracy. The people did not mourn his passing. Rather, his death was seen as a relief. Caligula is remembered as a ruler who turned Rome into his playground, where cruelty and excess replaced order and stability. His short reign became a warning of what happens when absolute power falls into the hands of someone driven by vanity and delusion.
46. King Charles IX of France, 1560 to 1574. Charles IX came to power as a young man during one of the darkest times in French history, when Catholic and Protestant factions were fighting violently in the wars of religion. Instead of bringing peace, his reign is remembered for one of the bloodiest massacres in Europe. He had little ability to control events around him, and his court became a stage for manipulation and cruelty. The most infamous episode was the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572. Charles IX, under the heavy influence of his mother, Catherine de' Medici, and hardline Catholic advisors, gave approval for a limited strike against Protestant leaders in Paris. What followed was a wave of killings that spiraled out of control. Thousands of French Protestants, known as Huguenots, were slaughtered not only in Paris, but in towns and villages across France. The bloodshed shocked Europe and deepened divisions that would last for decades. Instead of bringing peace, the massacre fueled civil war, ensuring more cycles of vengeance and distrust. Charles was known for violent outbursts and mood swings. Contemporary accounts describe him as unstable, sometimes haunted by nightmares and guilt. He would later break down, convinced he had blood on his hands. His paranoia grew as France became more fractured, and he seemed incapable of holding authority together. He alienated both Protestants and moderate Catholics, leaving only extremists satisfied. In addition to this tragedy, Charles neglected opportunities for reform. Taxation was harsh, corruption was widespread, and trade slowed because of constant unrest. He lacked vision for the country's future, and instead allowed his mother and advisors to rule in his place. His personal cruelty also emerged in sport. He was known to shoot animals in Paris streets for amusement, an act seen as symbolic of his disregard for suffering. Charles IX died young at 23, his body weakened by tuberculosis and his mind tormented by guilt. His reign left France in chaos, with entire communities destroyed and families torn apart. Instead of healing divisions, he deepened them. His memory remains tied forever to the massacre, making him one of the most tragic and destructive rulers in French history. 47. King James II of England, 1685 to 1688. James II's time on the throne was short, but left a long shadow. He came after his brother Charles II and immediately began pushing England toward policies that many of his subjects feared and resisted. His rule ended with the Glorious Revolution, when he was forced to flee, but not before his actions caused deep distrust and unrest. One of his most damaging traits was his push for absolute control. James ignored traditional agreements between ruler and parliament, believing his word should be final. Instead of working with political leaders, he bypassed them, issuing royal decrees and filling offices with men loyal only to him. This caused resentment among nobles and commoners alike, who saw their freedoms under threat. Another major issue was his open Catholic faith in a country that had been shaped strongly by Protestant traditions. He gave Catholics high positions in government and the army, even when they lacked experience. This fueled fears that England might return to religious oppression. His attempts to change laws protecting Protestant dominance in society angered many, leading to secret meetings among nobles who began plotting against him. His reliance on intimidation worsened matters. He kept a standing army close to London, alarming those who saw it as a weapon to silence opposition. He also ordered harsh punishments against those who opposed him, creating an atmosphere of fear rather than respect. His failure to build trust made his downfall almost inevitable. The breaking point came with the birth of his son in 1688. Until then, many believed his Protestant daughter Mary would inherit the throne. But with the new child, a future line of Catholic rulers seemed assured. This pushed nobles and military leaders to act, inviting William of Orange to intervene. When William landed with an army, James found himself abandoned by many of his own supporters. Instead of fighting, James fled the country, throwing the royal seal into the Thames as he left. His flight sealed his image as a failed ruler, unwilling to stand and defend his throne. His short reign is remembered not for achievements, but for alienating his people, threatening freedoms, and sparking a crisis that forced him into exile. 48. Emperor Heliogabalus of Rome, 218 to 222 CE. Elagabalus, who became emperor at just 14 years old, is remembered as one of the most bizarre rulers in Roman history. His reign was marked not by strong leadership or military success, but by scandal, extravagance, and strange religious practices that shocked his subjects. One of his most controversial actions was introducing the worship of the Eastern sun god Elagabal, after whom he took his imperial name. He tried to replace traditional Roman gods with this foreign deity, building a massive temple in Rome and forcing senators and generals to take part in ceremonies. This angered both the religious elite and common citizens, who saw it as disrespectful to Rome's traditions. Elagabalus's personal behavior scandalized Rome further. He staged lavish banquets where guests were buried in flower petals or left unable to escape from locked dining rooms. He dressed in unusual costumes, sometimes appearing as a woman, and offered himself in marriage multiple times in ways that shocked the conservative Roman Senate. His disregard for tradition made him appear reckless and unstable. He also ignored pressing matters of state. While borders were under threat, he preferred indulgence in luxury and theatrical displays. He appointed unqualified friends and lovers to high positions, weakening Rome's administration. His grandmother, Julia Maesa, had to intervene often just to keep the empire functioning. Elagabalus grew increasingly unpopular with the Roman military, whose loyalty was vital. His strange rituals, wasteful spending, and disregard for tradition turned soldiers against him. By 222, his own guards turned on him. He was assassinated at just 18 years old, his body dragged through the streets before being thrown into the Tiber River. His reign left a reputation of chaos and disgrace. Instead of building Rome's strength, Elagabalus became a symbol of decadence and youthful folly, remembered more for excess and scandal than leadership.
49. King Otto IV of the Holy Roman Empire, 1209–1218.
Otto IV rose to power during a time of fierce struggles for control in Central Europe, but his rule is remembered as a tale of betrayal, failed ambition, and destructive choices. He was initially supported by the Pope in his bid to claim the imperial crown, but once in power, Otto quickly broke promises and made reckless decisions that left his realm weakened. At first, he swore to defend the Church's rights and honor agreements with the Pope. However, once he secured power, he turned against the very institution that had helped him. He seized lands belonging to the Church, angering the Pope and creating a lasting feud. This betrayal destroyed trust and cost him vital allies. Otto also launched an ambitious campaign to control southern Italy, directly challenging papal authority. This reckless adventure stretched his resources and brought little reward. His army suffered defeats, and his rivals grew stronger. The Pope excommunicated him, stripping him of legitimacy and encouraging other nobles to abandon him. His broken promises and rash wars gave rise to Frederick II, a more capable rival who gained wide support. As Frederick's strength grew, Otto's influence collapsed. He lost allies among the German princes, who saw him as untrustworthy. Even his former backers in England, tied to him by family, eventually withdrew support. By the end of his reign, Otto was largely powerless, confined to a small portion of territory, while Frederick rose as the new ruler. He died in relative obscurity, remembered not as a great emperor, but as one who squandered trust, betrayed allies, and pursued reckless wars that left his legacy in ruins. 50. King Michael of Romania, 1927 to 1930 and 1940 to 1947. Michael ruled Romania during two separate periods, both overshadowed by outside forces and national crises. His reign is often seen as one of weakness, not because of personal cruelty, but because of his inability to prevent Romania from falling under dictatorship and later Soviet domination. In his first reign, Michael was only a child, with real power held by regents. This left the country adrift, and when his father, Carol II, returned to seize the throne, Michael was brushed aside. His second reign came during World War II, when Romania was under the strong influence of authoritarian leaders and Nazi Germany. Michael found himself surrounded by powerful generals and politicians who left him little room to act. One of his boldest moments was in 1944, when he staged a coup against the pro-German government and aligned Romania with the Allies. This act shortened the war in Eastern Europe and showed courage. However, the country soon fell under Soviet occupation, and Michael had no power to resist. The Communists forced him to abdicate in 1947, ending his reign. While Michael is often remembered sympathetically, critics argue that he lacked the strength to defend Romania's independence. He signed decrees under pressure and allowed others to make decisions that shaped the country's fate. His inability to resist outside domination left Romania vulnerable to decades of communist rule. Though not personally cruel, his time on the throne symbolizes a failure to defend the nation at a critical moment. 51. King Ferdinand of Bulgaria, 1887–1918. Ferdinand of Bulgaria is often remembered as a man of charm, refinement, and ambition, but behind those qualities lay decisions that dragged his country into disaster. His reign spanned decades, yet his most defining choices involved wars that left Bulgaria broken, humiliated, and weakened. His hunger for power and misjudgment of alliances destroyed much of what Bulgaria had achieved in the late 19th century. Ferdinand rose to power in 1887, during a period of instability. Bulgaria had recently freed itself from Ottoman rule, and national pride was high. Instead of consolidating peace, Ferdinand was obsessed with expanding Bulgaria's borders to match the dream of a greater Bulgaria. This vision, while appealing to some, led him to gamble recklessly with the lives of his people. The First Balkan War of 1912 initially gave him glory. Bulgaria joined an alliance with Serbia, Greece, and Montenegro to push the Ottomans further out of Europe. Victories came quickly, and Bulgarian forces played a major role.
But Ferdinand could not resist pushing for more. He demanded territories promised to allies and grew greedy, believing Bulgaria alone deserved the lion's share of victories. This arrogance led directly to the Second Balkan War in 1913, when Bulgaria turned on its former allies, Serbia and Greece. The result was disastrous. Instead of gaining more land, Bulgaria was crushed and forced to surrender territory. The dream of a greater Bulgaria collapsed, leaving bitterness and resentment at home. Ferdinand's most destructive decision came during World War I. Hoping to regain lost lands, he sided with Germany and Austria-Hungary, ignoring warnings that this choice could bring ruin. At first, Bulgaria gained some ground, but as the war dragged on, the nation faced hunger, suffering, and heavy losses. When Germany collapsed, Bulgaria was forced to surrender, and the harsh peace treaty that followed stripped more land and resources away. His people turned against him. Once admired for his cultured manners and grand ambitions, he became a symbol of reckless pride. In 1918, after Bulgaria's defeat, he was forced to abdicate in favor of his son. He lived the rest of his life in exile, surrounded by luxury but haunted by failure. His reign left Bulgaria smaller, weaker, and deeply wounded, a tragic reminder of how one man's hunger for expansion can destroy a nation's future. 52. King Charles VII of Sweden, also known as Charles Knutson, 1448 to 1470. King Charles VII of Sweden, also known as Charles Knutson, is remembered for a reign filled with constant strife, rebellions, and failures to unite his kingdom. Instead of strengthening Sweden during a time when Scandinavian nations were struggling for dominance, his rule left the country unstable and plagued by conflict. He first came to power in 1448, chosen by nobles after the death of Christopher of Bavaria. Charles claimed the throne not only of Sweden, but also sought crowns in Denmark and Norway, sparking rivalry with other claimants. Instead of bringing unity, his ambition set the stage for decades of fighting in Scandinavia. The Kalmar Union, which had once promised cooperation between the three kingdoms, was torn apart by his actions. Charles faced rebellion from the start. Many nobles disliked his policies and alliances. Farmers rose in protest against heavy taxes, while rival factions invited foreign powers to intervene. His inability to create loyalty among his own people meant he spent much of his reign battling uprisings. His harsh treatment of enemies only deepened resentment. In fact, he was forced off the throne not once but twice, exiled as rivals replaced him. Each time he returned, it was not through skillful diplomacy or popular support, but because of shifting alliances among nobles. Economically, Sweden suffered under his rule. Wars drained resources, trade slowed, and ordinary people bore the burden of taxes. Instead of reforming systems or improving conditions, Charles focused on securing his position and fighting opponents. This short-sightedness meant Sweden fell further behind as other European nations grew stronger. By the end of his reign in 1470, Charles had lost the chance to make Sweden stable or prosperous. He died while still embroiled in conflicts, leaving his successors to face the same divisions. His time on the throne is remembered less for achievements and more for constant struggles and failures to unite his land. For a king who ruled more than 20 years, Charles left surprisingly little to celebrate, and his legacy is one of turmoil rather than progress.
53. King Victor Emmanuel III of Italy, 1900 to 1946. Victor Emmanuel III sat on the throne of Italy during one of the most dangerous periods of the country's history. While his reign lasted nearly half a century, he is remembered not for great leadership, but for allowing fascism to rise unchecked, enabling Benito Mussolini's dictatorship and leading Italy into disaster during World War II. At the beginning of his reign, Victor Emmanuel seemed modest and reserved. However, when Italy faced crisis in 1922, as Mussolini's fascist movement gained momentum, the king made a fateful decision. Instead of defending Italy's fragile democracy, he allowed Mussolini to seize power during the March on Rome. He could have ordered the army to stop Mussolini's black shirt forces, but instead he handed Mussolini the prime minister's position. This single choice gave fascism legitimacy and doomed Italy to decades of oppression. For the next 20 years, Victor Emmanuel remained on the throne while Mussolini dismantled freedoms, persecuted opponents, and dragged Italy into aggressive wars. The king rarely intervened, preferring to stay silent rather than risk losing his crown. He signed laws that stripped Jews of rights, gave Mussolini sweeping powers, and tied Italy to Hitler's Germany. By failing to act, he became a willing partner in tyranny. World War II exposed Italy's weakness. Italian soldiers were sent to hopeless battles in Greece, North Africa, and Russia. The nation suffered bombings, starvation, and occupation. When Mussolini fell in 1943, Victor Emmanuel tried to save his image by dismissing him, but it was far too late. Italians saw him as complicit in their suffering, and Allied leaders distrusted him. After the war, pressure grew for him to abdicate. In 1946, a referendum abolished the throne altogether, and Victor Emmanuel went into exile. He died in Egypt, far from the country he had once ruled. His legacy is one of cowardice and failure, remembered as the king who handed power to Mussolini and failed to protect his people from dictatorship and war.
54. King Philip III of Spain, 1598 to 1621. Philip III of Spain inherited one of the richest empires in the world, stretching across Europe, the Americas, and Asia. Yet his reign is often seen as the beginning of Spain's long decline. While his father, Philip II, had been strict and hard-working, Philip III preferred comfort and pleasure, leaving real power in the hands of his favorites. This neglect led to corruption, waste, and decline. The most notorious figure of his reign was his advisor, the Duke of Lerma. Philip trusted him completely, allowing Lerma to control government decisions. Under Lerma, offices were sold for money, taxes were raised unfairly, and corruption flourished. Instead of addressing problems, Philip withdrew into hunting, festivals, and prayer, ignoring the suffering of his people. Philip also presided over one of the most destructive acts in Spanish history, the expulsion of the Moriscos, descendants of Muslims who had converted to Christianity. Over 300,000 people were forced to leave, many of them skilled farmers and artisans. This crippled parts of Spain's economy, leading to depopulation and decline in agriculture. The decision was motivated by religious zeal and fear, but it left Spain poorer and weaker. Meanwhile, Spain's costly wars drained treasure. Silver from the Americas could not keep up with endless spending. Philip's government declared bankruptcy more than once, and Spanish prestige abroad began to wane. Instead of reforming, Philip seemed content to let things slide. By the time he died in 1621, Spain was still powerful, but clearly on the path to decline. His son, Philip IV, would inherit an empire already weakened by waste and mismanagement. Philip III is remembered as a ruler who wasted opportunities, allowing corruption and poor decisions to damage the empire. His love of comfort over responsibility turned a strong kingdom into one burdened by decay. 55. King Wenceslaus IV of Bohemia, 1378 to 1419. Wenceslaus IV of Bohemia is remembered as a weak and troubled ruler whose failures contributed to religious conflict and unrest in Central Europe. Though he inherited titles as King of Bohemia and King of the Romans, he lacked the energy, focus, and vision needed to manage his realms, leading to instability that erupted after his death. From the start, Wenceslaus showed little interest in governing. He spent much of his time hunting, drinking, and indulging in leisure rather than handling state affairs.
Important matters were delayed or ignored, frustrating nobles and clergy alike. His neglect of duties created a power vacuum where others vied for control, weakening authority. His handling of religion was particularly damaging. During his reign, reformist preachers such as Jan Hus gained followers, calling for changes in the church. Instead of dealing wisely with the movement, Wenceslaus alternated between tolerance and repression. This inconsistency alienated both reformers and traditionalists. After Hus was executed, unrest exploded, leading to the Hussite Wars shortly after Wenceslaus's death. Politically, Wenceslaus faced revolts from nobles who resented his favoritism and careless governance. He was even captured by rebels at one point, an event that humiliated him and showed how little respect he commanded. His inability to control events meant his kingdom became divided and unstable, setting the stage for decades of violence. By the time of his death in 1419, Bohemia was on the brink of religious war, and the authority of the crown was in tatters. Instead of leaving a legacy of strength, Wenceslaus left chaos. He's remembered as a ruler who wasted opportunities, allowing divisions to grow until they erupted in bloodshed. His failures remind us how neglect can be just as destructive as cruelty in shaping history.
56. King Richard I of England, the Lionheart, 1189 to 1199. Richard I, famously called the Lionheart, is often celebrated as a great warrior and crusader. But when we look closely at his reign, we see a ruler who neglected his own country, drained its resources, and left England worse off. His story shows how glory abroad can mean disaster at home. From the very start, Richard showed little interest in England itself. He spent barely 6 months of his 10-year reign in the kingdom, treating it more as a source of income than as a land to govern. His heart was set on the Crusades, and for that purpose he taxed his people heavily, selling offices, lands, and privileges just to raise money. Entire towns were stripped of wealth to fund his wars in the Holy Land. His attitude was so careless that he once joked he would sell London itself if he could find a buyer. The Crusades brought him fame as a soldier, but little benefit to his subjects. Richard fought bravely at Acre and clashed with Saladin, but ultimately failed to retake Jerusalem. Instead, he agreed to a truce that allowed Christian pilgrims safe passage, but left the Holy City in Muslim hands. While this satisfied his pride as a negotiator, it did nothing to justify the enormous sacrifice of treasure and lives from England. On his way home, Richard was captured in Austria and held for ransom. To secure his release, his subjects were forced to pay an enormous sum, £65,000 of silver, an amount that devastated England's economy. Taxes rose again, peasants struggled, and resentment grew. Richard treated this ransom as his due, showing little concern for the suffering it caused. Meanwhile, at home, governance was left in the hands of officials who often abused their power. Corruption grew, law enforcement weakened, and disputes with France over land dragged England into further conflict. Richard's wars with King Philip II drained even more resources, forcing England into debt. Richard died in 1199 from a crossbow wound while besieging a small French castle. His death symbolized his reign, chasing minor conquests abroad while neglecting the kingdom that funded his adventures. Though celebrated as a warrior, he left England poorer, burdened with debt, and politically unstable. His fame as Lionheart hides the truth. He was a reckless ruler whose pride and obsession with war came at the cost of his people's well-being. 57. King Henry VI of England, 1422 to 1461 and 1470 to 1471. Henry VI's reign is one of the saddest and most destructive in English history. Coming to the throne as a child, he grew into a man unfit for leadership. His weak personality, bouts of mental breakdown, and inability to make firm decisions plunged England into the Wars of the Roses, a brutal civil conflict that tore the country apart. Henry was gentle and pious, But these qualities did not serve him as king. He was indecisive, easily swayed by advisors, and unable to enforce authority. As France pressed against English holdings during the 100 Years' War, Henry failed to provide clear direction. Battles were lost and vast territories in France that his father, Henry V, had won, slipped away. Instead of rallying his lords, Henry retreated into prayer and left military matters to others. His marriage to Margaret of Anjou was meant to strengthen ties with France, but it caused resentment at home, especially because Margaret was strong-willed and often acted in Henry's place. Many nobles felt sidelined and factions formed around rival claimants to power. Henry's passivity allowed these rivalries to grow unchecked, eventually exploding into open conflict. Henry also suffered from mental illness, including long periods where he could not speak or make decisions. During one breakdown, he didn't even recognize his own son. These episodes left the kingdom effectively leaderless, with nobles seizing opportunities to advance their own claims. England descended into chaos, lawlessness spread, and ordinary people bore the brunt of constant warfare. The Wars of the Roses, fought between the houses of Lancaster, Henry's line, and York, were a direct result of Henry's inability to govern. Thousands died, villages were destroyed, and trust in the crown collapsed. Henry was captured, restored briefly, and then deposed again. His final years were spent as a prisoner in the Tower of London, where he was murdered in 1741. Henry VI left behind a broken country, scarred by war, instability, and distrust of weak rulers. His reign shows how indecision and lack of strength can be as destructive as cruelty, turning England into a battlefield for decades. 58. King Charles VIII of France, 1483 to 1498. Charles VIII came to power at a young age and quickly revealed himself to be rash and short-sighted. His reign is most remembered for the disastrous Italian campaigns that drained France's treasury, weakened its influence, and achieved almost nothing of lasting value. Dreaming of glory, Charles claimed the throne of Naples in southern Italy and launched a massive invasion in 1994. At first, success came easily. His army, equipped with modern artillery, marched through Italy, seizing cities with little resistance. But Charles failed to secure alliances or plan for long-term control. His rapid conquest alarmed other European powers, who quickly united against him. When the League of Venice formed, made up of Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, the papacy, and several Italian states, Charles found himself surrounded by enemies. His forces were driven back, and though he briefly held Naples, it was soon lost. The campaign wasted enormous sums of money and cost thousands of lives, leaving France in debt without real gains. Back in France, Charles's neglect of governance caused further problems. He focused almost entirely on his Italian dream while ignoring domestic reforms. His subjects bore the burden of heavy taxation, while nobles grew restless. His failure to manage resources responsibly meant France entered the next century weakened, setting the stage for later struggles under his successors. Charles's life ended suddenly in 1498 when he struck his head on a door frame and died. His reign, though short, left a mark of recklessness. He gambled friends' wealth and power on adventures that brought only humiliation. Instead of strengthening France, he left it poorer, politically isolated, and mocked by its rivals. 59. King Ladislaus V of Hungary, 1440 to 1457. King Ladislaus V, also called the Posthumous, came to the throne as a child and spent much of his life under the control of regents. His reign is remembered for weakness, manipulation by powerful nobles, and the failure to provide leadership during a dangerous time for Hungary. Because he was so young when crowned, others ruled in his name. Nobles exploited this situation, enriching themselves and weakening central authority. The country fell into factional disputes, with rival groups competing for power. Instead of uniting Hungary against external threats, Ladislaus's government became paralyzed by infighting. One of the most damaging episodes of his reign was the handling of the heroic general John Hunyadi. Hunyadi had been a national defender against the Ottomans, But after his death, Ladislao had Hunyadi's son executed, fearing his growing influence. This act outraged much of the population, alienating supporters and destroying trust in the crown. Ladislao himself showed little interest in leadership. He spent much of his life away from Hungary, living in Vienna and Prague while the kingdom suffered from raids and internal unrest. His absence made him appear detached and uncaring, fueling further discontent. He died suddenly at only 17, possibly from illness, though rumors of poisoning circulated. His short reign left Hungary weakened and vulnerable to Ottoman advances. Instead of uniting the nation, it left it divided, with nobles mistrusting the crown and people disillusioned by failed leadership. 60. King Edward II of England, 1307 to 1327. Edward II is remembered as one of England's worst rulers, a man whose favoritism, poor judgment, and military failures led to rebellion, humiliation, and eventually his violent downfall. His reign shows how personal weaknesses can destroy a kingdom. Edward openly favored a series of companions, most notably Piers Gaveston and later Hugh Despenser, showering them with titles and wealth while sidelining other nobles. This favoritism enraged the barons, who saw their traditional rights ignored. The court became divided, and plots against the king multiplied. Instead of balancing his friendships with his duties, Edward deepened divisions that destabilized his realm. His greatest military disaster came at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1414, when his poorly led army was crushed by the Scots under Robert the Bruce. This defeat secured Scottish independence for years and humiliated England. Edward's failure on the battlefield destroyed his reputation as a capable leader. Internally, Edward mismanaged resources and allowed his favorites to exploit the people. Taxes were heavy, corruption widespread, and famine added to the misery of the population. His reliance on the Despenser family in particular provoked widespread rebellion, as they abused power and enriched themselves.
Even his marriage to Isabella of France turned against him. Neglected and resentful of his favorites, Isabella eventually allied with rebel nobles. In 1326, she and her partner Roger Mortimer invaded England, gathering support from those fed up with Edward's failures. The king was captured, forced to abdicate in favor of his son, and imprisoned. In 1327, Edward II died in custody under mysterious circumstances, likely murdered. His fall from power was as violent as his rule had been disastrous. Remembered for favoritism, defeat, and neglect, Edward left a legacy of humiliation. His reign remains a cautionary tale of how personal weakness and poor judgment can tear a kingdom apart.